The large room, which is fully stocked with camera equipment, was drowned in the number of people running around. Several actors talk amongst themselves about An Hyo-ju's invitation to film and wonder if it might be true. 2 actors are sitting waiting for a scene to start shooting. One of them thoughtfully reads the text, getting into the role. The second man feigns surprise, drawing attention to himself. In his opinion, he had not expected to see the first young man here. The latter indignantly replied that he too was an actor, to which the interlocutor said with a sneer that he was too far from that. The young man asked if his interlocutor knew about the second cast. He doesn't want to stop at just an extra, but wants to get an even bigger role. In response, the man only exhaled and said that no one was in his way. He could make his way on his own. The young man thinks he won't always be on the bottom. It's time to prove himself on the masses and go on, because today is the day the filming starts. A large number of actors are already standing on the set, all in good spirits and preparing to shoot the scene. The director demanded silence on the set. A young man wants to be the star of a movie by the famous Korean director Kang. The most important thing is for Kang to remember him. The director ordered everyone to get ready. Cameras rolling. The actors are ready. We're going to start shooting the scene. It's time for the guy to stop living on $8 a day. From this moment on, his new life begins. Lots of flags and copy. Everything looks very real, and not at all like a normal movie set. Enraged warriors in iron armor, with weapons in their hands, run into battle against their enemies. Ordinary people in clothes and bandages stood up against the armed warriors, pelting them with anything they could get their hands on. The young man sees a large number of people and can't believe his eyes, as the crowd was much smaller than the people present here. The whole field is filled with confrontation between armed warriors and ordinary people. From all sides you can smell smoke, see flames, and a hail of arrows. There were many people with swords and lighted torches on the platform. The young man couldn't understand where they all came from. Everything seemed real to him. Armed soldiers are in a position of readiness. Their guns are loaded and pointed at their opponents. They are ready to open fire. One of the fighting men immediately fell, struck in the head by a bullet. The peasants rushed to the attack. So many stones flew toward the soldiers that the young man involuntarily thought that there could not have been so many on the platform. People in peasant clothes began to fall from the stone barricades one by one. The setting light illuminated the scene of the battle. Large ladders were attached in several places at once. The invaders climbed them to attack. The peasants pushed back some of the ladders and set some of them on fire. One by one, the soldiers began to fall. There was no more way up. The battle between these nations was bloody. What was happening was no longer a battle not for life, but for the last minutes of one's life. It was now that Kim An-seong was about to enter the stage. He had to pull himself together to give his best. The ordinary inhabitants immediately went on the counterattack. With pitchforks, scythes, and axes, they all fought back without fear. There was a loud cry. The leader of the peasants cheered his partners and assured them that victory was theirs. Everyone rushed to the attack. A broad-shouldered man with a thick beard ran at the enemy with an axe. There were shouts of joy all around. A man with a torch in his hand swore to kill them all. All the peasants give their best and work hard for their people. Across the battlefield, men from both sides fall lifelessly and are defeated. The armor-clad warriors strike deadly blows with their swords. People fell dead with deep and irreparable wounds. Their eyes rolled lifelessly upward. They wheezed heavily and could no longer find the strength to stand. The warriors mercilessly continued to shed blood. The guy was impressed with the acting, mentally nominating the actors for an Oscar. Weapons continued to clash with a loud clang. The entire space was filled with the sounds of steel and the screams of people. Several men attacked the armed foot soldier and stoned him to death. He was unable to do anything. The time was nearing the end of the filming of the scene. The young man looked around to survey the area and the remaining people. Stepping on the hot ground, he couldn't get a good look at the assistant or the director. It was in this scene that his character was to die. The boy staggered and fell to his knees, clutching his chest. He bent in half from the pain and pretended to faint. Unable to stand it, he fell to the ground. There were shouts all around that less time had been spent on this scene in the last shoot. Victory shouts were heard all around. The commoners had defeated the armed warriors and defended their land. The boy slowly opened his eyes to see what was going on around him. Breathless bodies lay everywhere. From above, the massacre looked like a crimson field of blood. People waved their flags triumphantly from the stone heights and shouted after the surviving soldiers never to return to their lands again. For everyone, victory meant a great deal, and everyone had a different motive for entering this battle. The sacrifices were inevitable, but not in vain. The young man slowly rose to his feet and looked around. The filming of the scene should have been over by now. He noticed a man lying next to him and thought he had fallen asleep. The young man reached out to wake him up since their roles for the day had already been played. The boy saw that there was a lot of artificial blood on the body of the lying man. He also thought that the clothes would not be able to be washed afterwards. But turning the body over, the young man noticed the scarred skin and frozen expression on his face. Shock paralyzed the young man's body. He looked at the man's breathless body and could not believe that he was actually not moving at all. Fear and terror flooded the mind, and on impulse, the boy covered his mouth with the palm of his hand, trying to hold back the screams and the nausea that was coming up. With a shaky hand, he slowly reached for the man's frozen face, not realizing if he really wasn't playing. Slowly but surely, his fingers kept coming closer and closer to his face to see if the man was breathing. He simply couldn't believe what he was seeing. The man wasn't breathing. His eyes were wide open and staring upward, completely oblivious to the guy leaning over him. Suddenly, the realization of what was happening came into the young man's head. His body was completely paralyzed with fear. His pupils flickered sharply from side to side. The man was not breathing, and that could only indicate one thing. The boy turned pale. Now he felt sick. He breathed heavily, replaying the considerations and the whole situation in his head. Kneeling down and looking at the breathless body, he realized that it was all real, and the man lying there was no longer showing signs of life. The trembling in his hands continued unabated. Still on his knees, he couldn't fully comprehend what was happening. A shiver spread throughout his body. My teeth clattered against each other so hard that it drowned out all other sounds. He tried to quiet all his worries by covering his lips and looking at the man completely detached. Then he slowly rose to one knee, trying to find the strength to accept the situation. After that, the young man rose fully to his feet and stared blankly straight ahead at the lying body. All around, all the survivors were examining the lifeless opponents and searching every part of their bodies and clothing. They were finding more and more victims. The young man could not move at all and continued to stare blankly at the same place. Somewhere in the distance, loud cries could be heard. Someone came up behind him and gently touched his shoulder, asking if he could hear him. Being distracted from his thoughts, the boy abruptly turned around with frozen shock in his eyes. The gleam in his eyes expressed bitterness and pain. This man was clearly not just a stranger who had fallen at the hands of the enemy. The man who had called out to him froze in place with a stupor on his face, not knowing whether to say anything now. Kim An-seong mentioned Mr. Kim with sorrow. His eyes watered, and a few more bitter tears flowed down his cheeks. His voice trembled. A little more, and he turned to screaming, grievingly repeating that Mr. Kim was lying breathless on the ground. He waved his arms relentlessly in front of the silent man, expressing all the pain and emotion he felt from what he had seen. Guy wanted to do something. He couldn't accept that Mr. Kim was no longer with them. Gently, a hand settled on his shoulder, a calm and steady voice notifying him that he knew it all. Panic was slowly settling into the guy's mind. The man could have been taken to the hospital, called an ambulance. There was a chance to save him. The young man broke down into a scream, mercilessly accusing everyone of being indifferent to Mr. Kim and the fact that he could actually still be saved. But suddenly his emotional outburst was stopped by a hard slap, causing him to jerk violently. The man's patience ran out. He raised his tone and said rudely that this is war. You need to get a grip. The man shouted that dozens, if not thousands, of people lose their lives every day. And he tried to convey this to the panicked guy. Losing the rest of his sanity, the young man sank heavily to the floor. Leaning on his arm, he tried to regain his breath. The people passing by looked at this picture, and only with their gaze expressed their sympathy for the grieving young man. The man said that one has to get used to the fact that there are always casualties in war. His interlocutor agreed that one should keep oneself in control. The young man really wished it was a dream. It couldn't be reality. There was no other option. Her nose pinched and her eyes slowly wet, and the rolling tears left behind wet paths on her cheeks. The bodies of warriors and ordinary people lay around. Every one of them was wounded in some way, stabbed through or barely touched. The young man saw everything. He finally realized how many people were dead and how many lifeless bodies surrounded him. He could no longer hold back the tears pouring down and put a hand to his mouth to keep from screaming at the heaviness and pain he felt in his chest. Those around him restlessly asked if everything is all right, but the young man shuddered all over with quiet sobs, unable to stop. The boy slowly opened his eyes. He couldn't understand where he was and why he was lying down. He sat up quickly in one motion, looking around. In the darkness, he could only make out the outline of the tree crowns. Turning his head in different directions, the young man began to regain consciousness. He tried to locate himself and to understand what was happening. Suddenly, a glimmer of hope dawned before the young man. Unless, of course, this was again a figment of his hallucination. Everything was cloaked in shadows in the evening, and ahead of him the young man saw the silhouette of a little girl in front of him. She looked at him with an interested look, holding a bowl of water in her hands. Suddenly, images of the past battle and the number of abandoned human souls rose up in front of his face. Fear gripped the young man's body. His breathing became very rapid and intermittent, and he felt as if his heart were about to burst out of his chest. He remembered everything that had happened before. The crumbled bodies were imprinted on his memory forever, and he would never forget the horror. The guy twisted in half, and the gag reflex made itself felt after all this time. Some man walked by, paying no attention to the stranger who sat not far away. Suddenly, the young man turned hopefully to a passing man, asking what was wrong with Mr. Kim, to which the man only shook his head silently, tacitly saying that was the end of it, and continued on his way. The young man's gaze sank sadly downward. He replayed the recent events in his head once more. And next to him still sat a little girl, who watched with her big and kind eyes him in his hurricane of emotions. Her small hands gently touched the boy, expressing a small, albeit childlike, encouragement. She raised her eyes. All the world's sorrow seemed to be reflected in them. The girl looked intently at the pale face of the grieving man. The girl turned away and stood up quietly. She went somewhere else, leaving Kim An-seong to himself. He noticed a small bowl of hot food and drink beside him. It must have been left especially for him. He couldn't move his hand, so his gaze was fixed on the food. The young man thought about everything that had happened. His attention was drawn to the two men, so he raised his eyes again, looking at them. One of them asked the other if his neck was okay. The latter assured his interlocutor that he had dodged in time and was lucky enough. When he heard talk of death, he immediately covered his eyes with his hands and tried to cover his ears so as not to see or hear anything. He couldn't contain his emotions, and soon the infrequent sobs turned into a pitiful cry of despair. The young man's mouth curved in a curtain of sorrow and pain. Many continued to fight for their lives, even with severe wounds and losses. Some were on the verge of life and death. With torch in hand, armed men patrolled the area. They protected the area from possible dangers. The crunching of twigs and leaves was heard in the distance. Someone was approaching from the thick of the trees in the direction where the boy was sitting. A rough voice sounded in the darkness. The man said that the young man had better drink what was brought to him. It would help, and he would feel better. The young man turned his head in the direction from which the voice had been heard. He looked with interest at the man standing in front of him. The boy came to his senses and realized that the man standing in front of him was the man who was supposed to be his mentor. The man looked at the boy with surprise. The young man looked closely and recognized him as the main actor, Kim Men-jin. The actor's hand slowly lowered beside the young man. He sat down leisurely beside him, making himself comfortable. The man said that the prince would soon ascend the throne, and with his army, they would definitely be able to drive away the enemies. Now it was time to gather their strength. They need to protect this place. The guy needs to live to see this moment, because the rest of us still need him. He looked mesmerized at his mentor, listened to everything he said, and thoughtfully agreed with him. The man said that one should only think of the goal. All the people involved in this war are fighting to win for themselves and their people. Mentor rose slowly and headed somewhere in the darkness without saying another word. As he stared at his mentor's back, the boy replayed all the words he had heard in his head. Still, at his mentor's recommendation, the young man picked up a bowl of food and scooped up a single spoonful of food. It was as if two different people were fighting in him. One side didn't want to eat or drink, and the other side realized that he really needed to do something and couldn't stay hungry. He needed to regain his strength. The young man began to quickly devour the food until it was finished, not giving much thought to how he looked or what he was doing. Suddenly, that same little girl appeared in front of him and asked if this guy was from Hanyana. The young man smiled and replied that it was from there. It had been centuries since anyone had called his native Seoul that. Admiringly, the girl looked at the guy and said with hope in her voice that she wanted to go there too. The boy replied that she would definitely stay there, and the girl smiled. The young man agreed to accompany her immediately after the war. Two pairs of dark eyes looked at each other. The young man thought about his old world and wanted to go back to the movie set. The girl looked at him devotedly and simply could not believe that it could be a dream. The young man did not believe that all this was even possible. Memories came flooding back that he knew the faces of everyone here. The guy looked around quickly, looking around for anyone he'd seen before the movie. Indeed, none of the actors were around, but the young man immediately recognized Seokjun from behind. Nearby, his acquaintances Mr. Sangi and a woman whom the young man also remembered by sight were sitting and chatting. Over there in the corner, another man he recalled was taking a header, but confusion filled his entire mind. There was a scathing whoosh of split air from somewhere above, but no one had even noticed it at first. The arrow glittered in the sky and quickly approached the young man and the little girl. The little girl immediately shoved Kim An-song away and covered him with her back from the unexpected danger. Sheer shock and horror froze in the older man's eyes, feeling the weight of the child's body that had saved him. There was an arrow sticking out of the little girl's back. She reacted quickly and protected him from being killed. There was a look of surprise in the girl's eyes. The guy immediately picked her up in his arms, screaming fearfully from the intense sudden emotion. Tears kept coming to the corners of her eyes, breaking through her closed eyelids. The girl said in a quiet voice that she wanted so much to visit the capital. Unfortunately, fate had decided otherwise. A small trickle of blood slowly flowed from her lips, mingling with her tears. The boy looked at it all with a blank stare. He was on the verge of losing another person before his eyes. There was no more strength to hold himself back. A desperate cry tore through him, and he let himself scream. Tears spurted from his eyes, streaming down his cheeks. Suddenly, a loud buzz of human voices filled the space. Praise of good acting was heard. The young man tried to explain everything. The girl in his arms asked to be released and complained that she was in pain. The young man squeezed her too tightly in his arms. As soon as the guy unclenched his hands, the cute girl who had taken the fatal blow immediately turned around and ran away. He no longer felt solid ground beneath his feet and only slowly settled down. My head touched the floor and my mind was completely blank. It was very hard mentally. The whole consciousness seemed completely confused. It was unthinkable. His eyes closed from overexertion and the guy is lost in guessing what really happened. Billions of small stars modeled in the city's night sky. The office of the movie company towered above the small streets and stalls amidst the darkness of the deep night. Inside the building, work continues. All the electronics are turned on and people were going about their business. In his office, Director Kang sat behind the huge monitors. Next to him stood his assistants and underlings, fast-forwarding and watching certain scenes, emphasizing details and spotting flaws. All this was the director's responsibility. More and more people gathered near him, each one approaching with some question or clarification. The man was looking thoughtfully at the screen of a large monitor, where some fragment was paused. He leaned back in his chair carelessly, fixing his attention on something. A certain actor caught his eye, which completely captured his attention. The man asked who the guy was. The answer was a puzzled exclamation from one of the assistants, who certainly didn't understand who he was talking about. The director pointed his finger at the screen where Mr. Kim Man-sung's desperate face was captured. The assistant hesitated, for he didn't know the actor's name because of the minor role. Kang thanked the employee and allowed him to go about his business. The man was surprised by the guy's acting and the fact that he was an extra. He grumbled quietly to himself, tapping his finger nervously on the table. It was a clear indication that he was emotionally disturbed and that he was trying to express his displeasure. The scene was off script, so Kang wasn't sure he could use it, but this scene was too well acted to just throw it away. At this time of day, the city buses were completely free. You could choose any seat you liked. There were quite a few empty seats, and Kim Man-sung tiredly settled down on one of the seats. My head was filled with a huge amount of thoughts after filming the fight and still tormented by the memories and emotions experienced. It was like he'd lost his mind, or he was dreaming the whole thing. He couldn't say for sure, but given what he'd felt at that moment and how it had ended up, he couldn't confidently assume anything anymore. The bus slowly reduced its speed as it approached another stop. The door slowly pulled aside and let the guy into the street. He slowly stepped down onto the asphalt, thinking about what had happened. Step by step, he thought about what would happen next, how it had happened at all, and whether it was worth fighting it somehow. The guy wasn't sure he could play it any further. It was too hard for him to bear these emotions of the character. But even though it could really only be a dream, Mr. Kim, who was left for dead in the scene, was perfectly fine, as if nothing had happened. He kept going over and over these thoughts, unable to come up with an answer. He didn't notice that he was already there. And stopping in front of some building, his head rose up, surveying the walls before him. His house seemed especially cozy to Kimanu today. The building was several stories high and had white walls with bars on the windows. When he got home, the first thing he did was to throw his backpack off his shoulders and onto the floor. He thought again about the unfortunate day of the shoot and couldn't explain what he was feeling. The boy flopped down on the bed without even undressing. All he cared about now was what had happened, all the feelings and theories he'd built up. Confused, the boy summed up that he didn't understand anything. No matter how much he thought, no matter how much he wondered, nothing became clear. Some thought suddenly came into his head, causing him to open his eyes wide. The young man quickly got out of bed. He had to check everything immediately. Walking over to the computer, he turned on the system unit and quickly started searching for something on the internet. The computer gave a critical error and had to be restarted and checked for viruses. In 5 minutes, Keyman had resolved the issue and was now fully engaged in the search. He stared intently at the monitor. He searched the internet for information about what might have happened to him. The young man's first thought was to find information about the live-action movie. Unfortunately, the World Wide Web didn't know anything of the sort, so the young man searched further. He found various forums about supernatural phenomena. Leafing further, the young man saw a more realistic explanation. The search suggested an explanation of hallucinations and their treatment. The boy exhaled quietly. This explanation didn't fit him. His face didn't look at all enthusiastic. The guy felt completely exhausted from searching for information. It was time for him to get ready for work. In the light of day, the tall brick building did not burn with LED signs, but only looked dim against the bright blue sky. His gaze slid over the names and assessed the appearance of the building. The young man stopped in front of the hospital. He stood in front of the hospital and wondered whether to go in. On the one hand, what had happened was like a hallucination, but he felt normal. And looking into his wallet, the young man looked at the last bills that lay in it. The boy hesitated. There wasn't much money left, and you can't make much money on an extra. We'd have to save money. Exhaling briefly, the boy decided he'd give up on the hospital for now. He'd take a day or two to look at it, and then he'd see. The young man stood near the entrance to the hospital and decided that he would not go there today. And slowly turning around, he walked in the opposite direction, starting his day. The young man walked leisurely under the tall trees in a crowd of people of different ages. The noise of people's voices was all around. He worked part-time as a car washer, so the first place he went to was a car wash. As was his custom, the young man first thoroughly wiped the windshield of the car and went around the top of the car in a circle. He tried to do his job well and soaped the windows and the rest of the car several times with detergent, and then rinsed everything off well with water. The young man said goodbye to the client and said he had to go. Satisfied with the result, the driver thanked him for his work and said goodbye. The next place was the movie set. There was already a lot of equipment and people on it. Assistants, the director, all the staff that helped with the shooting and the actors. Kim On-sung looked sadly at everything in front of him and realized that nothing had changed at all since yesterday. He took a seat on a vacant bench and pulled his part out of his backpack. It was necessary to repeat everything carefully. He was suddenly approached by a man, asking him his name and whether he was mistaken. Kim On-sung looked at the person in front of him in surprise and confirmed that his name was exactly that. The man said that Director Kong wanted to see him. The young man was very surprised because he had a minor role in the cast. Getting up, the guy followed the attendant who was leading him to Director Kang. The young man's face immediately stretched in surprise, and his eyes sparkled with joy at what he heard. He saw actor Kim Young-jin and Director Kang standing next to each other talking about something. Kim Young-jin was the first to notice the boy walking towards them. He realized that he was a young man who could become a man. The director turned his head in the same direction as his interlocutor. They both looked at the approaching Kim On-sung. Kim Young-jin bowed and said they would continue next time, to which Director Kang said goodbye to him. The actor walked away. As he passed by Kim On-seong, he paused for a second. He exhaled briefly, about to say something and drawing Kim On-sung's attention to himself with this action. The young man turned his head in the direction of a man passing by and heard flattering words about his acting. Kim Young-jin said with satisfaction and a smile that the kid's game yesterday was unforgettable. The actor patted the kid on the shoulder, showing that he was worthy of the highest praise. Kim On-sung looked surprised and listened to everything that was happening to him, not believing that it was all being said to him by actor Kim Young-jin himself. Suddenly, the director himself addressed the boy by name, reminding him of himself. The young man responded briskly, confirming that he was on his way. Kim Young-jin, smiling widely and chuckling, apologized to Kim On-sung for detaining him. The young man said goodbye and ran with all speed to Director Kim, who was waiting for him. Through his large sunglasses, Director Kong looked at the actor running towards him. He spoke first. Standing in front of the young man, the director asked Kim On-sung if he wanted a really big role in the movie. The guy was taken aback and asked again to make sure he heard it right. His face immediately lit up with joy. He couldn't contain his joy. He clenched his fists and yanked them down. The director's lips stretched into a big, satisfied grin when he saw the sincere joy of the young talent. He clarified that the role was not a major role, but from the story's point of view, it was a very important role. Kang was confident that the boy would do well. Kim On-sung glowed with happiness after hearing this and thanked him for everything said in his direction. The young man assured that he wouldn't disappoint. Smiling warmly at the boy, the director said that he believed in him. That's why he is giving him this role. All of a sudden, Kim On-sung smiled and clarified with the director exactly what kind of role he was to play. Director Kim smiled enigmatically and said that the actor will play the role of a prisoner of war who will be tortured and will say goodbye to his life at the end. The moon shone brightly in the light of the dark night. Kim On-seong repeated over and over in his mind that this was just a game, nothing more. He sat in a row with the other bound men, only one word resounding in his head. Game. Hands tied tightly to the chair the guy is sitting on. The staff double-checked each actor. Everyone was securely bound. The young man tried to move his legs. They were tied so tightly to the leg of the chair that he could no longer feel them. Kim On-sung asked if the ropes were too tight. He was told that loose knots would simply come undone during the scene. The experience completely captivated the young man's mind, but he tried to calm himself by remembering that there were stunts and special effects. He definitely needed to come to his senses. Otherwise, the point of all the hard work the guy had put into acting and movies was just zeroed out. Already more confident, Kim On-sung made a promise to himself that he wouldn't miss this chance for anything. After a while, the loud voices of the director and cameraman sounded. The cameras turned on and filming began. All the staff on the set were ready to shoot. The cameramen checked their cameras and went to their places. His eyes slowly closed. Through the fog, he stared faintly at the people who were being swallowed by the darkness. His eyes began to open a little, but no one was around. The young man assumed that everything had started again. The heavy air was hitting his lungs, and it was getting hard to breathe. He gulped loudly, feeling a growing uneasiness. The boy raised his head upward and met his gaze with a sharp blade that glistened in the firelight. 4 chairs with bound captives sat under guard. The man with the sword ordered them to tell everything they knew. The captives shouted that they wouldn't say anything. Even if a blade was put under their throats, the invaders wouldn't be able to do anything. One of the thugs looked at his blade and thought it would be a good idea to put his weapon to someone's throat. Kim Un-seong also offered to put a knife to his throat. He stammered and was himself taken aback by how slow and poorly he spoke the phrases. When he gathered his strength, he said confidently that his enemies wouldn't find out. A little more daring, the young man spat in the face of the thug standing opposite him. The man looked at the young man irritably and wiped what was on his cheek with his thumb. The enemy threw his deadly stare at him. He didn't recognize the information, the foolish peasants themselves asking to be killed quickly. The boy closed his eyes, trying to calm his emotions. He kept reminding himself that this was just a game, nothing to be afraid of. It was an act. Suddenly, a sharp blade flew up, leaving behind only a quick streak of silver glow. His eyes went wide and stared fearfully at the scene before him. The young man's gaze quickly drifted to the side, and he looked on in horror at what was happening. Droplets of blood splattered on the floor, growing larger by the second until they became a puddle. Shock filled Kim Un-seong's mind, causing a huge wave of fear for his life. It no longer seemed like a normal acting performance. His eyes widened with fear and his whole body became paralyzed. He was unable to make a single movement. Only single swear words appeared in his head in response to the actual blood splattering and threat to his life. A sharp blade was placed at the throat of another man. The man screamed in fear and tried to tilt his head back. Suddenly he wheezed. Blood sprayed out in all directions. The boy sat huddled in his chair in fear, gulping nervously for air. There were shouts of thugs all around, cheering for such fighting spirit from the captives. They would be glad to see how long it would last. Once more, the sharp metal surged upward and sliced the air. It was followed by the head of a man who had been caught in the act. Kim Un-seong didn't realize what was happening or what was in store for him. He begged his enemies to stop. Fear was overwhelming him, and it was hard for him to keep his mind clear. The young man demanded that they stop doing this. He didn't realize that they were really massacring people. It was like madness. Tears streamed down his face from the rush of emotion. He prayed that this would all be over quickly. The blood continued to drip slowly onto the floor. The stains grew larger and larger, and together they looked like a huge, deep puddle. At his feet lay the head of the man who sat next to him. In the darkness of the night, I couldn't see the guy's face, but I could sense fear and despair. Tears were pumping in the young man's eyes, and he looked down at the lying face in panic. The boy turned pale, pressing his lips into a thin line. A scream filled with anger and despair burst from his lungs. He shouted curses at the thug who had killed his partner. A huge man with a repulsive look stood before him and ordered him to speak in that case. He stepped closer to Kim Un-seong and repeatedly told him to spill everything he knew. The man stood beside his captive and lazily played with his honed blade, making it clear that his life was worthless. Screaming even harder, the boy repeated that he should just end his suffering with a wave of his hand. He began to curse again. The vicious little eyes only looked with hatred at the screaming young man that sat helplessly in front of him. His sword arm rose up without hesitation. The point of the weapon glinted in the darkness. A little more, and another would lose the ability to live. In the young man's desperate gaze, there was only determination and willingness to take such a desperate step. There was no cowardice left. Suddenly, a picture of his father and mother popped up in his mind, and the boy apologized for leaving this world first. His entire short life flashed before his eyes in a few seconds. He remembered the army, his army vacation, and his first love, Sae-yeon. After all, the young man had never confessed his feelings to the girl, and he suddenly wondered where she was and what she was doing. He sobbed, wondering why he was remembering everything that had happened in his life right now. He hadn't accomplished much, and it was a shame to lose his life. Droplets of blood suddenly splattered around the sides, mixing with the rest of the purple puddles. The severed head was slowly dropping lower by the minute, and the gaze was directed only forward. He saw the bound body in front of him, and he realized that he was seeing himself. Everything had fallen into total darkness. Suddenly, he heard the director's loud voice and realized he was still alive. Kang announced the end of the scene. The audience looked at the seated actors in amazement. Everyone looked shocked at what was happening and stood paralyzed without uttering a word. Out of the silence that stood out too much, there was immediately the sound of loud clapping of hands somewhere not too far away. Actor Kim Young-jin set an example for everyone and gave the young actor a standing ovation with admiration. Noting that the boy played his role brilliantly, The audience immediately supported the actor with delighted shouts and applause. Everyone marveled at the fact that the guy played the role perfectly. The director was also here and shared in the excitement. Suddenly, his assistant came up to him and said that something was wrong with Mr. Ki-man Seong. Director Kang looked at the young man carefully. The young actor was indeed fainting right before his eyes. The assistant director also turned his head and was stunned. It seemed that the young man had actually fainted. Perhaps he was very tired. The production assistants tried to bring him to his senses and asked Ki-man Seong to look at them, but he was unresponsive. His head was down and his eyelids were closed. The director was immediately informed that Mr. Ki-man Seong had fainted. Among the white walls and ceilings of the hospital room, there was a hanging IV with a large amount of medicine. On a soft white cot lay an unconscious boy and made some inarticulate sound. Ki-man soon regained consciousness. His eyes opened abruptly, looking up at the ceiling. The young man only now began to realize where he was. He quickly sat up in the hospital bed, sweating cold sweat as if after a terrible nightmare. He grabbed his throat, trying to feel if everything was in place, coughing a little and wetting his throat with saliva. Suddenly, a woman's voice was heard from somewhere off to the side, asking the young man how he was feeling. The girl was dressed in a burgundy shirt with black pants and looked exquisite against the guy lying in the hospital bed. He recognized her as Gojo Yoon, and he still couldn't tell if it was a dream or not because of the past events. The guy patted his cheeks sharply to bring himself to his senses and check what he could feel and what he couldn't. He wondered if he had felt those spanks or not, and the girl looked at him in surprise. He was a little hesitant to ask if he was alive to be sure from the other person. Ju-young only stared at the guy in silence and was a little surprised at the behavior of the person sitting down. A smile spread across her face and the girl sighed briefly, catching her breath and not answering the question. Instead of answering, her hand held out a coffee can to Ki-man Sun, asking him to take what she had brought him. Ko Ju-yeon praised the young man admiringly and said that she was really excited to watch the filming of that scene. Turning around, she headed for the exit of the room. The boy was surprised that she only gave him a can of coffee, said a few words, and left. He slicked back his hair a little in bewilderment, trying to come to his senses and realize what was going on, but he wasn't very good at it. Ki-man Seong was lying in a hospital room after the incident. Visitors and doctors came to see him, checking on his condition. Director Kang naturally couldn't stay away from a rising star caught in a strange situation. The young man was pleased with the attention of the great director. They talked a lot about the upcoming filming, the guy's health, and his roles. Actor Kim Min-jin also came to the boyfriend's house many times to check on him and talk about various topics. After the hospital, Ki-man Seong's life went on, and he continued acting. He worked with director Kang and honed his skills. The young man did not forget about his other work, and went not only to shoots, moonlighting elsewhere, at a car wash. Time ran inexorably, not stopping for a minute. The warm summer had passed, and the leaves of the trees had turned yellow. Ki-man Seong was absorbed in his work and didn't immediately notice that the yellow leaves of the trees had fallen, exposing the branches. It was getting colder every day. One day, the director announced that the next shoot was over. The young man froze when he heard those words. As he turned around, he heard Kang congratulate everyone on completing another shoot and thank them for a great job. Everyone clapped. This was the filming of the last scene of the movie. All cameras are off, and they will not be immersed in this atmosphere again until the premiere of the movie. There was a buzz of human voices in the movie theater. Everyone was walking around the shooting pavilion discussing the upcoming screening of the movie. Near the entrance to the hall was a huge poster with the title of the movie, Hangju Mountain Fortress, the year 1593. Ki-man Seong stood in the hallway and looked at the poster, thinking about something. There were a lot of people everywhere that the guy didn't pay attention to. He was looking proudly at a fragment of the movie he had made, anticipating how good everything looked in the frame. Suddenly, someone called his name. Ki-man Seong was immediately wary. The first thing he thought was that he was back in medieval reality, and it was someone he knew. The young man turned his head to the side in surprise, trying to remember who the voice belonged to. It seemed familiar enough. Luckily, it was Miss Ko Ju-young. She smiled and greeted the young man as he was a bit hesitant himself. She warmly asked how Ki-man Seong was doing, and wondered why the young man was still here since the movie premiere was about to start. The young man replied that it was just for fun, but the girl nudged him a little and told him they should go in since the movie was about to start. All the rows of the theater hall were filled with people. Today was the first time they were going to see the already edited and finished movie. The lights went out in the hall. The screen showed the title of the movie, Hangju Mountain Fortress, 1593. The narrative went at its own pace. People in the audience were amazed at the way the cameraman showed every little detail of the filming. The audience praised Ki-man Seong's acting, with one of them whispering to the interviewer that he was skillful in his acting, giving him goosebumps. Someone suggested that this character would be removed from the ranks of the living, but but it was countered that this character would definitely be saved. Many viewers were interested in the character played by Kim Un-sung, as they had never seen this man on set. The guy felt real despair and transmitted the spectrum of his emotions through the theater screen. Everyone in the audience felt it. The audience was too engrossed in the footage shown. The movie turned out to be remarkably good. The very moments of the battle appeared on the screen. Bodies lying on the ground with swords in their chests and bodies disemboweled. The men on the stone wall who drove in their enemies with everything they had, and cursing all who fought against them. Triumphant and happy people with tears in their eyes who were able to triumph with blood and sweat. The scenery was changing. The battle was over. The screen time was already coming to an end. The screen went dark, showing the credits. A small group of people walked onto the stage, greeting everyone in the audience. The audience clapped loudly. Taking the microphone in his hands, the presenter asked if it was interesting to watch the movie. The man admitted that he too had been touched to the core by the movie. Raising his hand to the side, he was pleased to introduce the audience to those who gave this wonderful movie. There were 6 people standing on the stage, including both girls and men. They were all waiting for their turn to speak. The director and the main character told everyone sitting in the audience about the filming of various scenes and laughingly told jokes. Kim Un-sung listened enthusiastically to all the stories and words of those who spoke on stage. He also applauded enthusiastically after each speech. The young man felt a little sludge in his soul and envy because he didn't play the lead role and didn't get that kind of attention. His hands clasped together, and he promised himself that next time he would be on stage as the lead actor. After all the honors were over, everyone in the hall began to come out and discuss what they had seen. The corridor was filled with voices again. The guy moved with the crowd towards the exit, ignoring these annoyances around him. Next to him, he heard 2 people discussing and admiring what they had seen. One of them was praising the performance of the actors. This was followed by praise for actor Kim Min-jin. Kim Un-sung frowned a bit again because what else would you expect? The interviewee said there was one actor who played amazingly. Unfortunately, he could not remember his name, and said that at the end of the movie his head was blown off his shoulders. Kim Un-sung immediately turned around and heard that his acting was considered very cool, and at that point in the movie, everyone in the audience was admiring that bit. A smug smile played on his face, because he did not remember the name. But his role was discussed by almost all the audience. After pressing the elevator button, the young man decided that that was enough for now. If people already liked his game, then there would be more to come. Kim Un-sung was standing relaxedly in the elevator wearing a gray jacket, and then from the back someone addressed him by name. Kim Un-sung turned his head back looking for the one who had called him, keeping the thought in his mind that all day long, someone was calling out to him. In front of him stood a tall girl with black gathered hair and strict glasses. She asked the guy to talk to her for a while. The girl apologized and held out a black business card that said, Director Yoon So-yeon and contact information. The young man took the business card and was surprised that MS Entertainment was here at the movie screening, and the director approached the young man specifically. He couldn't believe his own eyes and was very much surprised at what was happening. He raised his head looking directly at his interlocutor and asked a little apprehensively what business they had with him. The girl smiled slyly and asked a counter-question about what Kim Un-sung himself thought about it. She explained that she would like to call the actor to join their company. Kim Un-sung couldn't believe his ears. He was the one that MS was inviting. The large building of MS Entertainment towered among the other structures. From the upper floors, the people looked like ants. Kim Un-sung was a little worried. It was the first time he had ever been so close to the center of the film industry. He was amazed at the size of the company and their building. He walked leisurely down the corridor to the designated spot. A guy with fiery hair, dressed in a suit, walked by beside him. Kim Un-sung was deeply impressed by the man's beauty and watched his face intently without hesitation. He assumed that the man is a celebrity, because the appearance of this brightly shouts about it. The boy had become discouraged at the mere sight of a man in this company, and doubted whether he would really be taken to such a place. Be that as it may, he remembered Principal Yoon So-yeon's disposing face, and doubted that she could make such an evil joke. At the spot, he saw Yoon So-yeon. Smiling, the girl said that she knew in advance that the guy would still join them. Kim Un-sung good-naturedly replied that he was the one who should thank the girl for the invitation and the chance given to him. A smile blossomed on the girl's face, and she immediately asked if they could go straight to the contract. The young man agreed with her and sat down on the vacant couch opposite Yoon So-yeon. They talked a little about the young man's hobbies. The girl's secretary brought coffee, and Yoon So-yeon began to outline the advantages of working with them. They discussed the terms of the contract. Kim Un-seong was shown the papers, and he was a little worried that he wouldn't understand a word of what was written, but he took them nonetheless. Especially the girl would be able to help him if he didn't understand something, so he started to worry a little less. Yoon So-yeon suggested pretending that the young man accepts all the terms and they can move on to signing the contract. A drop of sweat appeared on the boy's face, and thoughts surfaced in his mind that he was finally going to be a real actor. The pen slid slowly across the paper, calligraphically inked out each word. The girl told in parallel that these conditions are the best that Kim Man-sung can get in the movie industry. Yoon. So Yeon smirked and asked Kim Man-seong if he understood what he was talking about. He looked at her in bewilderment and asked her what it meant, because the wording and the words said sounded rather strange. The girl's head lowered slightly, and with that her gaze went back to the papers. She said she was taking a risk in this situation. The guy was taken aback by such words and stared at the company director with a mute question in his eyes. Yoon. So Yeon corrected her glasses and admitted that if she were to be honest, she trusted her eyes more than she trusted Kim Man-sung himself. A lump came to the young man's throat, and he swallowed convulsively, and continued to listen silently to the headmaster's words. Yoon. So Yeon said that she has a request anyway, so it's worth the effort for both of them. The boy agreed unhesitatingly, cocked his head up and down, and promised to work hard. After scribbling one last time on the paper, the girl slid him the sheet along with a pen and offered to sign the papers since everything was going so well. Suddenly she asked to wait because she noticed a blank space in the paperwork. Her finger gently touched a small space on the white paper. The girl pointed to the place where there was an empty space instead of text. The young man's eyes rounded at what he saw, and he suddenly cursed to himself. Yoon. So Yeon pulled the piece of paper towards her, and wondered aloud what they would have done if she hadn't seen it. They would have missed the most important part of the contract. Her hand quickly began scribbling on the contract sheet, filling in the missing part. The shocked young man froze in place and shouted out loud in surprise at the amount that was spelled out in the contract. 5 million won. Yoon So-yeon was surprised by the guy's behavior and words. She made a remark and rebuked him for not seeing well. The young man covered his mouth with his hand, not understanding what was going on and why such a large sum. The girl said that the company isn't that poor, and she personally found an actor like Kim Man-sung, and it's not 5 million won. The guy took the paper in his hands again and started counting out the tens. This time he was surprised to count 50 million won. The young man froze in his chair, unable to look away from that number on the paper and unable to believe his eyes. The young man's eyes opened wide with surprise. He couldn't imagine such an amount even in a year. He had already seen these amounts in bills right in front of his eyes, and these figures seemed simply exorbitant. The young man took a pen and signed his name. He was handed several bags in his hands and began preparing him for his new life at Miss Entertainment, sending him further down the building. The young man had an appointment with a tailor to have him measured for stage costumes. After trying on a black jacket and pants and a white shirt with a maroon tie, Kim Man-seo smiled at his reflection in the mirror. The private suite turned out to be quite large, furnished and with everything we needed to stay. The view from the panoramic window was magnificent. The same high-rise buildings and streets with passers-by were visible. He immediately sent his mom the money and called her on the phone. Mom asked him if he had earned the money. They said goodbye warmly. Kim Man-sung bragged all day about being a real actor. He invited a few friends over to the bar at his own expense because he is now rich. Toward evening, everyone gathered around the bar discussing the news and everyone's personal lives. They started talking about Man-seong's acting and everyone started congratulating him. One of his friends asked if he would kiss famous actresses. The second person laughing said that he was crazy because Man-seong was just making his debut and had a long way to go. With a laugh, the young man agreed, and once again sincerely congratulated the aspiring actor on a great debut. The guy smiled happily at the offer of a drink to his early career. Everyone raised their drinking glasses. There was a toast to Kim Man-seong's success. Laughing, everyone echoed the speech. The next day, when the sun was already up, the doorbell rang. No one answered, so there were several knocks on the door. The guy was snoring on the long sofa, ignoring the knocking. His socks were scattered, which spoke volumes about the evening well spent. The knocking on the door continued, so Kim Man-sung barely opened his eyes and deigned to get up to see who had come to see him. He saw a model-looking guy standing in front of him. When he took a closer look at him, he noticed a cross earring on his ear. Kim Man-sung didn't immediately realize who was standing in front of him, so it wasn't until a few seconds later that he remembered the celebrity that he saw in MS. The guest reproached the young man for his lack of concepts of time. According to the guest, the young man should have arrived at the meeting 10 minutes ago. He handed Kim Man-seo his red-colored business card that had his name and involvement with MS Entertainment written on it. As it turned out, it was his manager Moon Young-bae, and his face didn't look happy. The young man looked from the business card to the face of the man standing in front of him in surprise. He remembered that the manager was supposed to come today. Kim Man-seong quickly got ready and got dressed. They went down to the company cafe and took a vacant table to begin their discussion. The man introduced himself once more. His name is Moon Jo-bae, and he is Kim Man-seong's manager from now on. He will be in charge of his schedule. Smiling softly, the young man warmly replied that he fully relied on him and trusted his vast experience. The manager started talking about how director Yoon Sama herself had recommended Kim Man-seong's candidacy, so he had heard about him. Kim Man-seong felt very embarrassed that so much attention was being paid to him alone. He looked away, embarrassed. Trying to smooth out the atmosphere a bit, he mentioned that Mr. Manager was older than him and could address him on a you basis. To which Moon Young-bae looked at his interlocutor in amazement, as he was only a manager, and replied that it was fine. Kim Man-seong felt a little embarrassed, so he only had to agree with his manager's words. Moon Jo-bae held out the script and offered to discuss it first. The new script was about the Darkness Stalker. The manager explained that this was the movie the young man would be playing in this time. He in turn looked carefully at the title. My gaze slides over all the content on the paper, unable to believe that all of this is really happening for real. Again and again, he touches his finger to the printed letters with his name and the name of the company next to it. A little unsure, Kim Man-seong asked if it was possible to find out about the upcoming role, at least in general terms. Manager Moon smiled and explained that Kim Man-seong in this scenario will have to leave his life from the stabbing. The actor's face immediately showed shock, and his eyes rounded at what he heard. As it turns out, he will have to endure more than a dozen stabbings. It will all be done by a serial killer, and the guy will die brutally. Kim Man-seong's role shook him to his core. A slight shiver came over him, and his face betrayed it all. The young man closed his eyes, trying to concentrate on his new role and dizzying career. But he wasn't quite good at it. Panic seized the young man, and he opened his eyes again. Memories of the experience came flooding back to him. Sweat beaded on his temples as he remembered the moments of despair and pain. The heads flying from his shoulders immediately appeared before his eyes. Every minute he remembered his own head falling to the floor. Fear crept into every millimeter of his body and rolled down his neck as droplets of sweat. He was shaking all over, and his lost gaze ran across the paper, looking for invisible support that wasn't there. His lips closed into one thin line. Kim Man-seong's gaze faded completely because of thoughts and memories. His eyes slowly rose a little higher, looking to see if his interlocutor had noticed the confusion. As if nothing happened, Manager Moon smiled and continued to talk about Kim Man-seong's upcoming role. Folding his hands in a lock, he reiterated what was required of the actor, and at whose hand he would bid farewell to life. The actor repeated, in a slightly shaky voice after his interlocutor, the words about the serial killer. Jo-bae gathered all the papers into one stack and looked up satisfied. The manager assured the young man that this role is very important, so the young actor will be able to shine in the movie industry. With a shaky hand, Kim Man-seong reached for the coffee that was next to him on the table. He opened the lid, and the liquid inside the glass shook with emotion. The young man wondered if he had enough skill to do it well. The manager smirked and said there was nothing to worry about. He only needed to prove himself the way he did in the last movie. With a smile on his face, he said the guy's scream in the last movie was amazing. He liked the throat-slitting scene. Kim Man-seong's face turned white with fear. The manager persuasively said that the boy would realize that this role was definitely for him. Not believing the words he said, the young actor hesitantly queried whether manager Jo-bae was actually sure of what he said. My hands were shaking from fear, and so the coffee was beating against the walls of the glass, almost spilling over the edge. The scenes of the upcoming role that the young man had just imagined appeared in his mind. He had already seen the carnage of his body. The young man saw his newly severed head already in the new movie and the killer running away in the distance. He saw his companions who arrived on the scene too late and stared at his breathless body. Kim Man-seong could clearly see his fingers curled up from the cold, which were forever frozen in this pose. The manager asked how he was so good at playing roles in which he dies. The young man thought about it and didn't hear the question. When he caught himself, he looked up and asked to repeat himself again, as he didn't hear what he was asked. With a small smile on his face, his interlocutor repeated the question, asking about the previous movie that Kim Man-seong was in. The one looked away quietly, not knowing how to comment on that, and just continued to be silent. With great amazement, Manager Moon talked about the severed head scene and praised his acting. In his opinion, it was one of the best scenes filmed recently in the modern movie industry. Kim Man-seong clenched his teeth and thought that this wasn't a game at all. So he bit his lip slightly in excitement as he thought of what to say. He began to speak softly, and Jo-bae's manager threw a questioning look at him. Rubbing the fingers of his hands together, the young man nervously asked if he necessarily had to fulfill that role. The answer was a puzzled look from his interlocutor. It was just a great role, specially chosen for him. The smile returned to Manager Moon's face, and he replied that the actor might not fulfill the role. Kim Man-seong questioned with hope in his eyes, asking if it was true that he might not play this role. The manager explained that the young man is free to do as he wishes, but it would be considered a breach of contract. The actor looked at the manager perplexed, not understanding what he was talking about. Manager Moon cited the actor's inattention and poor familiarization with contract terms and penalties. Kim Man-seong looked at the manager incomprehensibly. Feeling an unpleasant burning sensation somewhere in his chest, and a premonition of something bad. Sliding his hand to his briefcase, his interlocutor rummaged through the contract. Taking out a stack of papers, he laid them out on the table and asked the young man to pay attention and reread the contract in question. All the terms of the contract were written on the sheet. It was also clearly stated that the contract would be cancelled if the role was rejected. Manager Moon indicated that these points are agreed upon and signed between the actor and the company. The guy carefully reread all the terms and nuances of the contract and stared at the papers with incomprehension. The manager went on to say, and added that in addition to canceling the contract, a lawsuit would also follow. Not believing everything that was said, Kim Un-sung stared at his interlocutor with large, confused eyes. Putting the contract back, the manager reminded of the additional interest to be paid to the actor if the contract was cancelled. In a sly voice, he sums it all up and leaves no choice for the actor, leaving him feeling rather depressed. But there was no limit to his horror, mixed with shock. The young man could clearly feel the ground slipping away from under his feet. His personal manager left him alone with confusion, pointing out that the choice was left to Kim Un-sung. Already sitting in his apartment, the guy shook his leg measuredly, being somewhere deep in his thoughts. Images of the past surfaced in his memories. He remembered his home and his mother's warm voice. Every moment in his mind, he saw the smiling faces of his friends. It all led to a strange and lingering sensation. The boy was really confused. Lying on the big couch in the living room, it was hard to make a choice about the role. Sighing heavily, he looked around the room he now inhabited. There was a table with a few chairs in the center. There was nothing else. The young man picked up the 50 million won paychecks from MS Entertainment. He immediately remembered Yoon So-yeon and her words that they both needed to do well no matter what. To make matters worse, if the contract was broken, he had to give back part of the deposit. That was what Manager Moon was talking about today. With his lips pressed together, Kim Un-sung still made his choice. He got up from the couch and began to lift all the couch cushions one by one. He urgently needed to find his phone. The young man quickly found Moon Youngbae's manager's contact and hesitated. He wasn't sure he was doing the right thing. Kim Un-sung still dialed his number and pressed the call button. It might be wrong, but there was no way out. A few beeps passed until a familiar voice was heard on the other end of the connection. The young man said a polite hello and apologized for the slight difficulty. He agreed to take part in the movie on their terms. The upper floors of MS Entertainment stood out brightly in the blue, cloudless sky. Walking into the building, the first thing Kim Un-sung saw was an impenetrable crowd of people, where the quiet hum of voices echoed on either side of him. The guy was a little embarrassed by so many people present and pulled out his phone to check if he was at the right place. After making sure he had come in correctly, the young man continued walking straight down the hallway. His hand clutched the smartphone tightly, expressing obvious anxiety and fear. In his head, the young man reassured himself that this scene was not real. After a while, the young man reached the right door, and his hand reached for the knob to open it. But suddenly there was a dull thump in his shoulder, and he staggered back. Kim Un-sung perplexedly turned his head to the side, not realizing where the push had come from. As it turned out, he was pushed with his shoulder by actor An Young-woo, who was familiar to him from the last script. The script, his name, and the name of An Young-woo in the lead role immediately popped into my mind. In spite of his age, he was perfect in every role. His dark hair and the same eyes definitely remembered Kim Un-sung for a long time. After all, his imagination immediately threw up pictures of the upcoming shoot. John Woo appeared before him with a predatory gaze and a bloody face. This image would haunt him for a long time. Disdainfully pushing Kim Un-sung away with his shoulder, An Jung-woo continued to knock on the door. It took the young man some time to calm down. Only then did he start the actor as he was, in his shirt, without a bloody face. Kim Un-sung continued to look at him with suspicion even after that. It was hard for him to breathe at the sight of John Woo. For a while the young men stood like that. Kim Un-sung was a little ahead, but John Woo wouldn't let him pass first. Kim Un-sung gathered his courage and dared to turn his head back. Even so, he had the look of a hunted beast. Therefore, An Young-woo contemptuously told the young man that he could not last that long. No one dared to compete with him. The great actor looked around just in case to see if there were any witnesses to their conversation. There was no one in sight, and John Woo moved forward decisively, pushing the young man away from the door with his shoulder. Kim Un-sung was surprised. In addition to the fact that they are in the same movie, John Woo also acted exceptionally boorish and only ruined the mood. There was a huge sign hanging on the room they were both so anxious to enter, saying it was a script reading room. There were about a dozen copies of the script on a large table. On the cover, the inscription "Stalker of Darkness" read in large print. In the center of the room, 12 tables were connected together so that a square of empty space was in the center. Name tags were placed at each location. Director Yoo Jin-soo and screenwriter Kang Soo-jin have yet to arrive. Only 5 of the 12 people at the table were seated, but the seats for the audience were taken. They were constantly making noise, interrupting each other. Suddenly the door creaked faintly, but it was enough for the people present to notice the young man entering. An Young-woo leisurely entered the script reading room, and enthusiastic cheers could be heard from both sides where the audience was. The young man held himself proudly and independently. It was obvious that the actor in the fashionable gray sneakers knew his worth. Everyone around him started whispering. Kim On-sung figured out that he was a year older than the actor. John Woo made his debut while he was in university. The actor walked on, and all the spectators recognized him. One guy said it was the first time he saw him live. The other said he was a first-class actor. A young man in a blue shirt said hello to the actor. The woman who was standing next to him raised her hand up in greeting. An Young-woo bowed politely. The handsome young man had outstanding acting skills. He was able to fit into any role. The actor smiled. The young man realized that everyone was looking at him now. Everyone wanted to see his role as a killer in the new movie. Kim On-sung saw the success of a rising star. The young man was somewhat dejected. He realized that Young-woo was the public's favorite. All the participants of the reading were seated at a table. Kim On-seong was seated right in front of his opponent, which made him feel a little depressed. On the other hand, it was a good opportunity. After all, he got to star in the same movie with a terrific actor. Kim On-sung closed his eyes, trying to imagine how long it would be until he too reached the same level of fame. Sighing heavily, the young man realized that dreams were dreams, but he had to work on his contract. He opened the first page of his script. It turned out that the young man was also recognized. The audience whispered among themselves that he had played a great role in the movie about the mountain fortress of Hengju. On the other side of the hall, they also discussed Kim On-sung's persona, that he was a late starter in movie roles, but he plays very decent. Two guys were talking about his screaming in a movie about a mountain fortress. One of them admitted that he got goosebumps. In another aside, the guy told the girl that his whole role was improvisation. The girl wondered how he would play it this time. While everyone was whispering behind Kim On-sung's back, discussing the actors, the young man himself was studying the upcoming role. Suddenly, a man in a blue sweater who was sitting to the left of the young man stood up. According to the nameplate, his name was Kim Chang-woo. The man in the sweater politely addressed his neighbor on the right, calling him by his first name. Kim On-sung took a surprised look away from reading the script. He turned toward the man in bewilderment, wondering who it could be. Kim On-sung looked at the man's face. After a few seconds, the bewilderment on the young man's face changed to a polite smile. He recognized his interlocutor. Of course it was Kim Chang-woo. The young man slapped his forehead in annoyance because he would have recognized him immediately. The man smiled politely. The man bowed to the young man, and Kim On-sung remembered that he had an extensive filmography behind him, with 3 movies garnering many views. With all of this, Kim Chang-woo immediately sat the young man down when he wanted to stand up and bow. The young man sat down on the chair loudly, embarrassed. Kim Chang-woo extended his hand for a handshake and said that he was very happy to meet them. The young man's hand twitched slightly in surprise. The man introduced himself and suggested that they work well together. The young man introduced himself in return and said he was glad to meet them. Kim On-sung raised his head and looked at An Young-woo. He was beginning to feel out of place. The famous gurus of the movie industry had gathered here. John Woo didn't seem to be paying attention to the young man at all. You couldn't tell anything from his eyes, but it looked like he was engrossed in the script. Kim On-sung continued to look at the young man and tried to imagine how well he could play the role of a psychopathic killer. He looked at the famous actor without taking his eyes off him. Kim On-sung tried to memorize his mannerisms and behavior. Suddenly, the door to the hall opened and the man said that he apologized for being late. They were late for a meeting with investors. The director suggested skipping the formal introductions part, since to a certain extent everyone was already familiar with each other's faces. Director Yoo Jin-soo assumed that everyone was already familiar with the contents of the script. The pages rustled from all sides. In order not to waste time, the director suggested going straight to the second page and starting a detailed breakdown of the roles. He read out lines about a man returning late from work. In a virtually deserted alley, he stumbles upon a killer. Director Yoo Jin-soo recalled that actors An Jung-woo and Jung Dok-heng will play these roles according to the script. An Young-woo finally took his eyes off his copy of the script and raised his head. He looked at the director calmly. When he heard his name, Jung Dok-heng furtively looked at the director. He tried to hold himself proudly, as he was not the lead in the movie. Thinking of his own, Dok-heng wondered aloud that training courses cost too much and they couldn't afford them in this position. The director looked at the actor in surprise and asked what was going on. Such a line was definitely not in the script. Dok-heng took hold of his head. He felt uneasy that he had forgotten where he was. The actor apologized and said that he had said all the wrong words. Improvising, An Jong-woo joined the conversation. He reprimanded and rebuked the actor for hitting people first and apologizing later. Dok-heng wanted to apologize, but John Woo looked at him with hatred and said that Heng was specifically annoying him, not forgetting to swear. Doc Heng noticed that the young man was overreacting and looked like he was going to beat him up. He assured John Woo that it was not on purpose. The man wanted to say that they had merely bumped shoulders, but suddenly realized that was unnecessary and pretended to cough. John Woo suddenly shrieked and demanded that he shut up. He shouted that the person he was talking to would become wise only after his death. The director clapped his hands and enthusiastically said that An Young-woo's acting had gotten much better over time. Everyone around applauded at the director's example, and he hastily calmed the audience and suggested moving on to the next scene. The girl in the light pink blouse began to read her lines from the script with inspiration. Her neighbor listened silently. An Young-woo responded to her politely at first. The girl raised her tone and the actor asked her to calm down. Unable to bear it, John Woo himself turned to shouting and improvised inspirationally, acting out his quarrel with the heroine of the script. Following the girl, 2 more victims came forward. One of them was a man in a red windbreaker. Stammering, he apologized to the killer. The girl in the orange t-shirt was scripted to look death in the face with contempt. The director liked her performance. Kim An-sung looked at the actors with amazement and delight. They were so coherent in their roles that they commanded respect. The director checked the list and announced that Kim An-sung was next. He was to play the part in the cab. The young man turned pale. He still doubted that he could play the role of his character well, and tried to convincingly answer the director. The young man froze. This is the moment when he is really in the spotlight, and in the very core of the film industry. The young man was very embarrassed by the fact that everyone was just staring at him as if they were expecting a perfect game. He didn't feel like he was on their level yet. Absolutely everyone was whispering and watching the newcomer with interest. He could play his new role quite well. Kim An-sung turned away embarrassedly to the other side. But even there he was secretly being discussed. The young man didn't know where to go. The dark-haired girl looked at him with undisguised curiosity. This new actor could be a real gem. Even star An Young-woo honored the young man with his attention and looked at him carefully. Now there was no longer any animosity in him. Director Kang put his fingers together and watched the young man carefully. He wanted to believe that they hadn't misjudged the newcomer. Kim An-sung noticed that the director was staring at him intently, and it made him feel even worse. A lump caught in his throat, and he swallowed convulsively. He was nervous, and drops of sweat trickled down his temple. Kim An-sung turned a few pages and opened the script at the right place. He started reading his character's lines. Kim An-sung asked the car to stop right there. Kim Chang-woo looked straight ahead, trying not to distract the young man. Surprisingly, the young man began to make sounds that mimicked gagging. There were shouts from the audience that vomiting was not necessary here. Someone else shouted that they should drink in moderation. Kim An-sung realized that he was acting just like a character in the script without his own will. The sheet said that the young man took out a black plastic bag. Kim An-sung was surprised at the intertwining of scenario and reality. The young man made unintelligible sounds that mimicked vomiting. It didn't seem to be very convincing. The audience murmured, and one of them told his neighbor that this newcomer was worse than he thought. The neighbor agreed that he was a bad player. The girl told her boyfriend that this could be simply because it was only reading the script right now. The young man doubted her words. Director Kang now looked at the young man differently. He too wondered what the reason was. His neighbor wasn't happy with what he saw either. Kim An-sung tried his best to put a smile on his face. He needed a way to lighten the mood. The young man tried to recite his lines in a cheerful voice, but he was shaking all over from the uncertainty and the fact that everyone was looking at him. Kim An-sung was leaning over the script. The young man couldn't understand why he couldn't get into the role of his new character. Suddenly, someone put a hand on his shoulder soothingly. He shuddered in surprise, as if he were in another world. He turned around and realized it was his neighbor, Kim Chang-woo. The man smiled and said that the young man had gotten too excited. He patted the young man on the shoulder encouragingly and told him not to worry too much. He just needed to relax. The young man finally smiled and allowed himself to relax a little. He exhaled and thanked his neighbor for his support. Kim An-sung raised his head, and the rising panic once again swept over him from head to toe. His script opponent An Young-woo looked at him with eyes like he was actually going to kill him. Kim An-sung stared at the famous actor in surprise. He didn't know what had caused John Woo to behave this way. Meanwhile, the future psychopath had gotten even more into character and squinted his evil eyes. And he looked at the young man with obvious hatred. Kim An-seo has rehearsed his role with a bit of grief, and director Kang has switched to John Woo and his neighbor. The next to speak was a young man in a green raglan. He was perfectly prepared and recited his lines by heart. The audience, who were sitting in the hall, were also flipping through the script. They played minor roles, but it was necessary to play all of them. Finally, the rehearsal was over, and Kim An-seo was relieved to be out in the fresh air and looked up at the sky with his head cocked upwards. Stepping outside, the young man finally exhaled. It seemed to him that this would never end. There was still a lot to learn. Kim An-seo thought for the first time that acting was very hard work. In addition, he now had a busy filming schedule. Suddenly, brakes squeaked behind him and a klaxon sounded. As it turned out, it was Moon Jo-bae's manager. Kim An-seo bowed to him, and the manager praised him for his good work. He reported that he had specially come to pick him up. The young man asked in surprise if the actor's transportation was stipulated in the terms of the contract. Moon confirmed that he had to give the guy a ride. The manager reminded him that he was also the one who brought the young man, so the question sounded strange. Kim An-seo chuckled nervously. Moon asked him to get into the car. Shooting was scheduled for the evening, and so all the cast and staff of the movie studio gathered in the pavilion as soon as it began to get dark. Having arranged the characters in the right place, the director took his place in the center and gave a wave to the cameraman. Everyone else watched. The actor started the first scene. An Young-woo in a dark hood with a knife attacks the frightened Yang Dok-hyun. In the next shot, a man in a light-colored sweater, trying to dodge the knife blade, grabs the killer's torso with both hands. An Young-woo throws his opponent off of him and throws him to the ground. He immediately swings his knife at him without giving him a chance to regain his senses. The director liked the actor's performance very much and shouted that the scene was cut. Everyone present applauded after Kang. Kim An-sung also clapped for the great acting. From all sides, there were cheers of appreciation for the work and effort of the actors. Director Kang asked everyone to calm down and announced that they would shoot one more scene and then move to another location. Kim An-sung immediately turned pale and his excitement faded away. When he turned his head, he began to suspect that he was the one in question. Kang announced that they would be filming the first scene with the murder of an eyewitness. The young man realized that his worst fears had been confirmed. Kim An-sung froze. He wasn't prepared for the fact that they were already filming a scene with him in it. He had expected it to happen a little later. Kim Chang-woo explained that it's a dark alley and the viewers won't notice anything, and they can save money on filming the scene this way. Kim An-sung tried to pretend that he now understood the director's intention. He couldn't accept that he was going to be killed right here. The young man retrieved his copy of the script from his bag and opened it to familiarize himself with the details. He began to flip rapidly through the pages in search of the very place that, in the script, ended his mortal life. The hero was to receive 33 stab wounds. The young man memorized the words, slammed the script shut, and froze in place. Director Kang asked An Jung-woo to prepare for his exit and stabbed Kim Man-sung 13 times. John-woo grinned, as if he had been waiting for this, and nodded in affirmation. He pulled out a knife, its blade glinting in the evening darkness. The director moved on to the next person in the scene and waved his hand, attracting the attention of the would-be victim. The young man responded confusedly. Director Kong asked if Kim Man-sung was ready to start shooting the scene. The young man gulped convulsively. He was short of breath. The director was still waiting for an answer, and Kim Man-sung faintly nodded. He couldn't say a word out of excitement. Kang said they start filming, and immediately he yelled at Kim Ki-jun. The man stammered and started apologizing to the director. Kang continued to yell at the staff, and Kim Man-sung realized that things were getting heated. He had to play well or he would be kicked out. Director Kang gave orders quickly and accurately, and soon he announced the start of filming. He asked everyone to get ready. Kim Man-sung was retreating deep into the stage, leaving shadows from the filming equipment behind him. He walked farther and farther, and after a while it seemed to the young man that he was enveloped in an almost imperceptible haze of mist. Everything around him was seen in red-gray tones. The young man walked leisurely to the beginning of the dark alley. Suddenly, his eyes blurred, and he saw everything as if through a fog. He also thought that everything was happening again. Kim Man-sung stopped. It was the same modern buildings and dark alley, but it had changed and was not like the old one. The young man felt simply disgusting. The boy seemed to have gotten so into the role that now he even had a headache. Kim Man-sung walked under a fence with many intricately woven wires stretching to it. The surface was porous. From the looks of it, it was some kind of construction site. There was a construction trailer in the center of the site. Only one lamppost with a lantern illuminated everything. The young man had to cross a section of the path in total darkness, and this led to panic. He couldn't stand it and ran to the next pole. Once in the lighted area near the parking lot, Kim Man-sung allowed himself to stop and catch his breath. Suddenly he felt danger approaching and turned around quickly. His eyes reflected animal fear. Kim Man-sung immediately rushed out. He was already tired, but now it was a matter of life and death. The young man ran as fast as he could afford. His body was already exhausted, and he was breathing heavily. Out of the corner of his eye, he felt, rather than saw, the long knife bearing down on him. The blade glinted ominously in the darkness. Kim Man-sung ran away from the attacker faster and faster, but his strength was running out. His body couldn't take such a frenzied load. The young man stopped and spewed the contents of his stomach right in front of him. The pupils of his eyes dilated with growing fear. The young man was breathing hard, and in every dark corner he saw danger to his life. When he decided that he was far enough away from the pursuit, Kim On-sun took a step back. The young man's nerves gave way, and he shuddered. Kim On-seong walked slower and slower, trying to regain his breathing rhythm. His heart had stopped racing a little. The young man wondered what might have just happened to him. He felt very strange, and it puzzled him. His head was simply splitting apart. Kim On-sun could have sworn that unfamiliar memories kept popping up in his head. Suddenly, a rather interesting thought popped into his head. Squinting, he remembered that there had been something similar in the script. The young man opened his eyes a little and thought that was how it was. Now he was sure that these were all his character's memories. This inference nullified all previous attempts to calm down a little. The young man panicked and looked around in horror. At this time, Director Kang was already in the middle of filming a scene with an unsuspecting young man. A close-up cameraman captured the lantern as the only source of illumination for a good 100 meters around. Kim On-seong had just reached the lantern and was panting by it. The gravel crunched under his lurching gait. The young man had a headache. He felt bad, for he had drunk a little too much the night before, and now he saw everything as if in a fog. As soon as he stepped a little away from the lantern, Kim On-sung heard a loud argument nearby. He sobered up immediately. Taking cover around a corner, the young man moved closer so he could see better. One of the men was proving to the other that he had hit him. Kim On-seong cautiously peered out from behind the corner of the building, straining to peer into the darkness and praying that he wouldn't be seen. Not far from him, there was a dark corner near the garbage cans. The light did not penetrate there, and the young men were having an argument. The first man told the man in the dark hoodie that he was out of his mind and regretted running into such a psycho today. He shouted that the man had pushed him first and was now talking nonsense because it was already clear that he just wanted an excuse to fight. The hooded man stared at him silently. In the darkness, only his eyes glittered with deadly coldness. He looked at the telegraph pole to which the powerful power supplies were attached. The assassin turned toward Kim On-seong. It seemed to him that there was someone watching him around the corner. Though the young man stood around the corner, the lantern treacherously illuminated him in such a way that a stranger's long shadow fell. Kim On-seong moved farther away from the corner he was hiding behind, praying that the assassin wouldn't come to him. The young man wondered what would happen next, and yet he still furtively peeked out from around the corner and continued to watch. The hooded man turned to his victim and reached into his pocket. After a moment, he started pulling something out of his pocket. The blade of a dagger glinted in the darkness, which the hooded man held tightly in his hand. Kim On-sung was very surprised at the appearance of the knife. It was very similar to his scenario with both the alley and the knife. The man amazedly told the killer that he was really crazy if he was going to stab him. The man silently moved even closer. The man began to back away, begging the killer to just cool down a bit on the way. He wished there was no one around to help him. Stammering, the man tried to apologize, but no words could save him from the midnight psychopath, and the killer plunged a knife into his stomach. Blood flowed in rivers and started dripping onto the wall of the building. The man was wheezing and kept trying to call for help. Blood was oozing from his mouth. The man was shaking with fear. He stared into the darkness with frantic eyes, still hoping for help. The killer yelled for him to stop yelling and swung the knife again. Just then, the man stabbed his assailant a little higher. The man fell down noisily. Plunging the knife in once more, the killer smugly said he should have watched his language earlier. Kim On-sung watched the brutal massacre and quickly clamped his hand over his mouth to keep from screaming in terror. He himself was shaking with fear. For the first time in his life, he was standing so close to a cold-blooded killer whose knife kept dripping blood. The man didn't stop there. He stomped fiercely on his victim, breaking his bones. The young man heard a terrible crunch. The man grabbed his opponent and threw him to the ground with all his might. Kim On-seong almost screamed. The assassin, meanwhile, continued to stomp mercilessly on his assailant's legs, breaking them. The sounds cut the young man's ears. Kim On-seong turned around carelessly and stepped on a branch. Realizing that he had made a mistake, he immediately tried to hide. The assassin's experienced ear instantly picked up the alien sound. He became alert and turned toward the sound. At the same time, the knife-wielding killer's hand flew upward, and the man went in search of the unwanted witness. Kim On-sung realized that it was becoming dangerous to stay here, and he began to slowly retreat back around the corner of the building. At once, the young man turned around and began to walk away from the scene of the crime. He hoped that everything would be all right, and that there would be no chase. Panic seized the boy, and he rushed away, ignoring the cracking of twigs and rocks under his feet and the shouts behind him. When he reached one of the buildings, he turned around cowardly. There was no one behind him, so he let himself catch his breath. Kim On-sung knelt down by the fence. He couldn't shake the thought that he had just witnessed a murder. The cameraman's camera kept filming the young man, who was scared to death and believed that everything had really happened. Kim On-seong felt like a hunted animal. He listened to every rustle and crunch, and danger could be lurking everywhere. The young man stood up to his full height and stood still for a while, constantly looking around. He wanted to make sure everything was all right. Kim On-sung couldn't understand what had happened. He had just passed the set, and it was as if he was in a different place. Suddenly, the young man heard footsteps nearby and froze with fear. He was sure that the murderer was still searching for him. The young man turned in the direction of the sound. Someone kept walking straight toward him, making no secret of their intentions, and it was very frightening. Footsteps could be heard coming closer and closer. Taking cover around the corner, Ki-man-sung watched. Finally, a shadow appeared on the stairs. The young man's pupils dilated with growing horror. A lump came traitorously to his throat. He swallowed convulsively. Panic stiffened his muscles, and for a few seconds, Ki-man-sung couldn't bring himself to move. He finally managed to stretch his legs, and he immediately ran away from the place. It didn't matter where as long as it was far away. The dark alleyway ended, and a well-lit city road appeared in front of him. People went about their business quietly. The frightened Ki-man-sung was glad to get out into a well-lit section of the city. He had almost gotten his heart broken as it was. His heartbeat slowly returned to its usual rhythm. The young man was coming out of the deadly darkness into the city, and he would not be harmed here. When he reached the corner of the building, Ki-man-sung finally allowed himself to stop. He stood there for several minutes, unable to catch his breath. Sweat trickled down his cheeks. The pale young man was sobbing from his recent emotions. By some miracle, he had escaped death. Ki-man-sung calmed down a bit and began to slowly look at the surrounding area. Something confused him about it all, and the young man opened his eyes wider, taking in the buildings and surroundings. Ki-man-sung looked at the couple who were walking nearby. They were dressed appropriately, but there was still something wrong. Two more people were walking in the distance. The huge neon signs cut his eyes, and he could only see their silhouettes. A dude with dark glasses walked by the young man with a proud and independent look. Ki-man-sung didn't realize where he was this time. There were cheerful girls in strange clothes walking down the street, and the young man tried to figure out what was wrong. He had a feeling of remoteness. With some surprise, Ki-man-sung looked at the signboard calling for a bathhouse in Daejeon City, Useong District. Another sign beckoned to attend public speaking classes. Right underneath it was a mental arithmetic course. The large orange sign cut a little unpleasantly into my eyes. Behind it was the entrance to the roller skating area. Ki-man-sung walked a little further and came across two more signs in a row. The library was next to the intelligence courses. The young man couldn't understand anything now. Not only were his memories coming back to him, but he was also in a different city. Suddenly, the young man saw some girl in a school uniform. She was walking leisurely and chewing on the road. Ki-man-sung apologized and said he wanted to know something. The girl immediately stopped and took a step back. Stammering, the young man asked if he was in Daejeon, but realized it was better to ask what year it was. The girl continued to chew something. Ki-man-sung suspected that something wrong was going on and fearfully asked to tell what time he was in. The girl was silent. She thought for a moment and went to her pocket. She thought for a while and looked in her pocket. The girl handed over a Motorola StarTick cell phone, which surprised the young man very much. He had not seen such cell phones for 100 years. Holding the phone in his hand, Ki-man-sung opened the flip phone with his thumb and looked at the screen. The young man couldn't believe his eyes. The screen showed the year 1995. Ki-man-sung looked more closely. There was no mistake. Today was the 17th of October in the year 1995. The young man turned pale. He could not believe that he was so far away from his own time. The surprised young man tried to understand what was going on. Suddenly, Ki-man-sung realized everything. Everything that was happening to him was directly related to the script. Scrolling back through the events, he clearly recalled the moment when manager John Bae placed the script on the table in front of him. He asked the young man to familiarize himself with it, and said that Stalker of Darkness was written based on a real crime. At that moment, Ki-man-sung looked at him incredulously, and asked if the manager was joking. John Bae revealed that the plot is based on a crime that was committed in Daejeon City, and it is still unsolved. Then the manager mentioned this particular year, and Ki-man-sung thought with amazement that he had somehow been transported to the day of the assassination. It was late evening. The stars shone in the beautiful cloudless sky, and the young man raised his head to admire them. But something had to be done about this situation. Ki-man-sung reluctantly walked along the lighted sidewalk among the other people. The young man looked at the very same signs he had marveled at a few minutes ago. The same bathhouse in the Useong district of Daejeon. The same mastery of public speaking courses. The sign below offered mental arithmetic courses. The windows in the building were flooded with light. The same bright orange sign beckoning visitors to spend their leisure time at the roller skating area. And a library, as if specifically located next door to the intelligence courses. The two signs next to it said so. As soon as Ki-man-sung read the last words on the signboard, it was as if something had pricked him in the temple, and the young man wrinkled his nose at the piercing pain. Suddenly, a haunting image of a young woman and a boy of about 8 years old appeared in his mind. Their faces looked happy. Kim Un-sung, after some thought, came to the conclusion that this is the family from his character's flashbacks. Something seemed to tell Kim Un-sung what to do next, and the young man resolutely lifted his head up. Kim Un-sung saw all of his further path and began his route. He walked slowly through the night city. It was quite strange to be back in the year 95, and the young man looked at everything along the way, as if living life anew. A short time later, Kim Un-seo was crossing a busy highway on a zebra. There was an apartment building across the street directly in front of him. The young man looked at the house number, at the car parked near the driveway, and incredulously asked himself if he had come to the right place. His character's memories pointed to this particular house, and the young man stepped closer to the building and decided to test his theory. Kim Un-seong walked the distance to the house and stopped at the entryway door. The place was well lit. The young man walked into the entryway and slowly climbed the steps to the first floor as if he had done it many times before. There was a proximity sensor installed in the entryway, and so each floor was lit in advance. Kim Un-sung had reached the second floor and was now leisurely walking onward as his memories prompted him. The steps were made of many small stones filled with cement, and therefore crunched characteristically under the young man's feet. Kim Un-sung came to the third floor. From what was sitting in his mind, he needed this floor. The young man stopped and looked around as if remembering where the right door was. He stood in front of the door for a while, questioning whether he even needed to do this. The young man's hand began to slowly rise and reach for the bell. Immediately, Kim Un-sung stopped himself. He wasn't sure if he was doing the right thing, and he couldn't know what was waiting for him outside the door. After hesitating, the young man made up his mind and again hesitantly reached for the doorbell. The doorbell was in perfect order. As soon as the boy pressed the bell button with his index finger, a melody sounded in the apartment. A woman's voice came from behind the door. The door lock clicked, and the door creaked open with a barely audible creak. The young woman from the recent vision stood on the doorstep. She smiled and said that her husband had also worked hard today. Kim Un-sung immediately recognized the woman. He instantly turned pale and started to back away in surprise. Just then, the little boy stomped noisily down the corridor. He happily called him Daddy and threw himself into his arms. The boy immediately wrapped his arms around his father's legs and clung to him. He had no choice but to stroke his head affectionately. Kim Un-sung was almost sweating. He only now realized that he was being mistaken for the man whose murder he had witnessed. The woman smiled and jokingly rebuked the boy for running out barefoot again. She told her husband that the table was set and everyone was waiting for him. Kim Un-seo froze in place. He couldn't think of a way to get out of this awkward situation and explain to the woman that he wasn't her husband at all. Meanwhile, the boy ran out into the hallway again and asked his father to go with him to the expo center this weekend. His eyes were burning vividly. The more Kim Un-seong looked at the mother and son, the darker he became. He realized that he couldn't drag it out any longer and had to make a choice. The woman noticed the change in his eyes and said that he was a little strange today. She asked him nicely what had happened to him. Kim Un-seong could no longer impersonate that person. Tears streamed down his cheeks, and the young man silently apologized to them. The guy turned his back to them and started down the steps. The woman asked him in amazement to stop and explain. Running out of the entranceway, Kim Un-seong jogged a little more by inertia and soon found himself at a bus stop near a parking lot. The young man walked between the car and the empty parking space. It was already chilly outside, and he had to hide his hands in his pockets. After stepping one more step, Kim Un-sung realized that he had nowhere to go, so he had to stop and decide what to do next. The young man was already tired of walking in promises for today, so he stopped and started rubbing his knees. The playground was deserted nearby. The only thing that broke the silence of the night was the creaking of the swings under the young man's weight. Kim Un-sung couldn't bring himself to go back to the strange woman with the baby. It didn't look like a movie about a mountain fortress. The young man measuredly rolled back and forth on the swing, and tensely thought that he needed to give the whole situation a good thought. On the one hand, he was told that the script was written based on real events, and there had been a series of murders in Daejeon. The young man squinted his eyes and looked at everything differently. Only he knew that he was not just an actor, but the real victim of that psychopath. The young man's eyes began to close slowly from fatigue. He could no longer resist. He had no strength even to lift his eyelids. Leaning his head on his knees, Kim Un-sung fell asleep, unable to stop thinking about what he should do next. Dawn was dawning. The sun began to rise higher and higher, illuminating the faded and gray boxes of buildings and dwellings. The young man started his new day by going to his place of work. He absent-mindedly shuffled his feet on the sidewalk tiles, barely dragging his feet. In front of him was the Korea Electronics Building. According to the victim's recollection, this is where he worked. Kim Un-seong didn't dare to go inside. He didn't know what he would have to do or how to behave, so he just wandered around the building. The young man remembered what his visit to the apartment had led to, and now he wasn't sure if he should go to work just because of those memories. Kim An-sung had already lost track of time and caught himself doing something he didn't understand. Fortunately, there was an internet cafe nearby, and the young man was glad for the opportunity to change his surroundings and learn more about the murder. As soon as the guy walked in, the doorbell rang and the receptionist greeted the young man. Some of the people were just sitting at tables. Choosing a vacant seat at the computer, the young man disdainfully thought that the first-generation Jindo was too ancient. The computer began to boot up, and the young man was disappointed to think that at this time they had not yet created search engines like Yahoo. After a minute, a graphical shell with news blocks was loaded, from which you could select the desired section. Kim An-sung started checking all the news links in a row, but found absolutely no mention of the murder anywhere. The young man was amazed that he had scoured a sea of websites and found nothing anywhere. It was strange that nothing had been published yet. Man-seong turned off the computer and started to think back. No, he didn't seem to be mistaken, and the murder had really happened yesterday. The young man leaned back in his chair and sighed heavily. The chair beneath him creaked unhappily. There was no time to waste, so Kim An-sung returned to his original position and stood up from the chair. The chair creaked again. The young man decided to revisit the crime scene again no matter what. Soon he was again in the vicinity of that ill-fated construction site. Kim An-seong walked down the alley, figuring that this was about where it had happened. The alley was dark, with the occasional streetlight. The young man passed the lantern post and moved closer and closer to the dark area. It was already getting dark, and he wasn't sure if this was the right place. Suddenly, a not-so-good thought crossed his mind, and Kim An-sung immediately stopped, staring at his black and white sneakers. The young man thought that he might die in his reality as well if he was killed in that time frame. Nevertheless, he decided to see it through to the end, though he continued on at a slower pace, looking around warily. A murder had indeed occurred, and the crime scene was fenced off with police yellow tape. So the young man stopped. He got as close to the fence as he could and saw large bloodstains on the wall and the silhouette of a man outlined in chalk. Unfortunately, it was forbidden to go any further. The police did their best and spared no expense in tying yellow tape around the entire dead end. Therefore, all Kim An-seong could do was look at the scene by getting closer to the barrier. He heard someone's footsteps, and the young man flinched in surprise. He almost lost his balance and grabbed the ribbon to keep from falling to the ground. Kim An-sung immediately turned toward the source of the noise, not yet knowing who else might need this place in the dark. The young man almost fainted. The hooded man walked straight toward him with a leisurely gait, hands shoved casually in his pockets. The man approached, and the young man was ready to swear it was yesterday's killer. The same expression in his eyes, and the dark mask on his face. Now Kim An-seong was more scared than ever. There was nowhere to run, and the killer was very close by. It was a bad idea to come here again. The young man looked at the assassin and felt sick to his stomach. His lips clenched tightly and almost trembled. He barely managed to swallow the lump in his throat. The assassin didn't even seem to look at the young man and simply walked past indifferently, rustling his hand in his pocket. The moment the man passed by seemed like an eternity to the young man. He was sweating and standing there, afraid to breathe. At that moment, Kim An-sung considered himself lucky, for the assassin had passed by a couple of centimeters away and didn't recognize him. The young man tried to carefully and stealthily turn around and look at the hooded man in his wake. That had been his fatal mistake. It turned out that the man had passed by and turned around, gazing at the young man's silhouette. Their eyes met. Kim An-sung realized that things had taken a bad turn and slowly turned the other way, hoping for a miracle. But the man asked him to take his time and said that the young man's face seemed quite familiar to him. Kim An-sung chided himself for coming here at all, and told the man that he was mistaken, and this was the first time they were seeing each other. Realizing that something irreparable was about to happen, the young man was really scared for his life, and his eye twitched in a nervous tick. Kim An-sung blinked his eyes a bit to bring them back to normal, and now he had to really be scared beyond belief. The knife in the man's hand glinted with death. Kim An-seong took a closer look and realized it was a butcher knife. The young man's pupils flickered in different directions. He just wasn't ready to die like this. He didn't want to believe he would die in this time. The man stepped closer and simply stuck the knife into him. The young man stared with surprised eyes, realizing that the steel was tearing his body. This was clearly not enough for the man, and he fiercely delivered blow after blow, keeping the young man on his feet. With each successive blow, Kim An-seong found it harder and harder to resist and not fall. He yelled out loud. The killer could not calm down and kept stabbing him. The young man covered his face with his hands and begged for mercy. Kim An-seong no longer had any strength left to resist. He bowed his head and his eyes began to close. The young man was wheezing and begging for help. Everything around him was drenched with blood flowing from the young man's wounds. Kim An-sung was struggling to get help, but he was not able to do so. But no one came to help, and in the dying fog, pools of blood were the last thing the dying young man's eyes saw. Near the construction site, the lantern on the pole continued to burn lonely. and no one was interested in another victim of the hooded killer. Suddenly, the darkness was cut through by the lighting equipment, and Director Kang shouted enthusiastically that the scene was successfully completed. Kim Un-sung saw nothing. To him, everything that was happening was in a blinding yellow fog. Only after a while did the young man realize that he was surrounded by several people, and there was nowhere to go. Kim Un-seong continued to grab onto the man and hoarsely called out for help, but only gurgling sounds came out of his mouth. The entire film crew enthusiastically watched the excellent play of the novice actor. Apparently, the company did not make a mistake with him. An Young-woo ripped off his mask and hood and looked at his victim in surprise. They had already played the scene, and the guy was still fooling around. Kim Un-sung was also surprised, but for a completely different reason. He thought that all of this was happening in the year 95. The young man immediately sat straight down on the ground and incredulously began groping his body. Someone came up to him and said that the scene was over. Kim Un-sung kept trembling and couldn't move away from his fear. It seemed unbelievable, but he had managed to survive again. He was breathing heavily. The young man was placed on a chair and given a drink of water. Even after a while, he could clearly feel his body being stabbed many times. Man Seong couldn't calm down. His hands were shaking, and he thought that he shouldn't have been in the movie in the first place. After a while, everything returned to normal, and Kim Un-sung decided to test some hunches. He remembered that the serial murder case in Daejeon had not been solved, and he had not found any information then. Kim Un-seong took the phone out of his pocket and allowed programmatic access to the internet. In a local search engine, the young man typed in a query about a serial murder in the city of Daejeon in the year 1995. The killer was never found despite all efforts. In addition, one of the victims was an employee of Korea Electronics. Kim Un-sung was confused, thinking that everything he had experienced was real. That meant that the murderer still existed too. Interrupting the young man's musings, a cameraman dressed in a blue raglan approached him and called out loudly. As it turns out, Director Kang suggests that they shoot another take for authenticity. Man Seong could barely contain himself from screaming. Meanwhile, the director and his assistants scrutinized the footage on the monitor. Kang fastidiously eyed the footage of John Woo grabbing the young man and delivering blow after blow. The director was completely impartial in evaluating the acting abilities of young people, putting himself in the shoes of the audience. Finally, Director Kang broke away from watching and looked up. He told the cameraman that the acting was good, but the situation was a bit boring. The cameraman stared at the screen in bewilderment. For him, the scene had been shot very truthfully, and the man tried to convince the director. But Khan stood his ground and began to raise his tone. The cameraman realized that it was better not to make him angry and agreed to reshoot the scene. The director looked silently at the young man who needed to play his part even more truthfully. All the filming equipment was already ready for reshoots, and the staff was just waiting for the director's wave. Kim Un-sung was surprised to hear that they were to reshoot the scene and asked again. He wanted to believe that he had misheard. The cameraman explained that the director found the scene a bit boring and asked for more verisimilitude to be added. The young man was not at all enamored with the prospect of being reenacted, and he stared dejectedly before him like a man on his way to execution. The filming began, and all unnecessary lighting was turned off. Now everything was the same as last time, only the stars shone in the darkness. Yes, there was one more lantern at the construction site and one in the middle of the alley, but it had yet to be reached. Repeating the episode, Kim Un-sung slowly walked towards the beginning of the dark alley, carelessly shoving his hands into his pockets. In fact, a man in dark clothes and a hood came out of the darkness to meet him. He also had his hands in his pockets. The young man thought that now behind that mask might be the face of a real criminal. It gave him goosebumps. Kim Un-sung couldn't move. He stood just in front of the dead end, and the hooded assassin came closer and closer. The young man stood waiting for his opponent. No matter how hard he tried, it was impossible to recognize the man beneath the dark hood and mask. The hooded man reached a cul-de-sac fenced off with yellow police tape and stopped in front of the young man. He looked at the boy carefully, and a sinister light appeared in his eyes. The killer told the young man that they seemed to know each other. Kim Un-sung couldn't breathe. A lump of fear came to his throat, and he swallowed hastily. Panic gripped his muscles. Kim Un-sung tried to step back a little, and realized with horror that he couldn't even move. He was gripped by a real animal fear. The young man decided to try to hit the man before he pulled out the knife and stabbed him through. He had no other choice. Kim Un-sung hesitated whether he should do it or not. The young man remembered the scene in the alley and the assassin who had stabbed him fiercely. His own death stood before the young man's eyes, and the frightened young man realized that he would not be able to resist. Meanwhile, the assassin came closer and bowed to the young man, thanking him for coming on his own and not having to search for him for a long time. Kim Un-sung turned around on the spot and rushed to run away. His own life depended on it now. The man immediately rushed after the young man in pursuit, pulling out a large butcher knife along the way, gleaming in the darkness. The young man mobilized all his strength and ran faster than the wind. At least that's what he thought. His eyes were petrified with fear. The hooded man was faster. The hooded man was quicker than the young man, but he grabbed the collar of his jacket and stopped the boy. With his other hand, the assassin plunged the knife into the young man's back, and his astonished eyes widened. Man Seong gasped. His lung collapsed. The man continued to deliver blow after blow, and more drops of blood appeared on the ground, which immediately spread into puddles. With each successive blow, the world around him lost more and more colors to the young man's eyes. He had only enough strength to scream in death. As if through a shroud of fog, Kim An-seong looked at the alleyway and the fence of the construction site with his fading eyes. His whole body shook from the new stabbing. The young man stared with his eyes. He knew that he had very little time left to live. As if through a dream, he heard the words of the director ordering John Woo to stop. They had completed the reshoot. The alley was once again flooded with light. Kim An-seong was lying on the ground. A camera crew stood around the dying young man. The young man couldn't bring himself to stand up. Just like last time, what was happening in the dark alley was a real challenge for him. When he opened his eyes, Kim An-seong realized that it was all filming and cursed himself for being soft, because he didn't even try to fight back against the killer. His whole body ached from the recent incident, so the young man struggled to get off the ground. Kim An-seong kept chiding himself for letting himself be beaten to death so easily, and not even trying to do something about it. At last he managed to straighten up. The director and cameraman stood opposite him and waited impatiently for him to come to his senses. Director Kong called the young man over and bowed to him. He recognized that the actor's performance was pretty good, but there was still something missing. Kim An-seong woke up and raised his head when he heard his name. He looked up with frightened eyes, realizing at once what was being asked of him. The director explained that his character cannot die powerless. The role has to be played in such a way that the viewer has no doubts about the desire to survive. The young man flapped his eyes in confusion. He didn't want to go through this hell all over again, because he had felt it all in real life. The director said he wanted to see a family man who fights desperately for his family, and the killer should be as brutal as possible. Kim An-seong dejectedly muttered in a fallen voice that he understood everything. He was going to have to face the assassin one-on-one again. The young man tried to tell the director as confidently as possible that he would try to play his part again. The hooded man with the evil eyes thanked the young man for not having to look for him and said he was a pretty brave kid. As he stumbled back, the young man thought that he would never get used to this scene no matter how many times it was filmed. But this time, he would try his best. The killer reached into his pocket and snatched up a knife that gleamed in the twilight. Death himself lurked at its tip. Kim An-seong put his hands up and started begging the man to stop. Fear froze on his face. It looked too real. The man was approaching the young man. He had already reached the beginning of the yellow fence, behind which his previous victim had recently lain. Shivering in fear, Kim An-seong asked the man why he kept killing innocent people. The dark-hooded assassin twitched in surprise, but tried not to show it. He wondered how the young man knew that. Kim An-seong turned pale with fear. Sweat began to trickle down his cheek. He guessed that this time he was facing a real killer. The man continued to question the young man. He assumed that the boy had seen him several times and asked who he was. Kim An-seong panicked, and his knees began to shake. His knees began to shake, and the tremors spread down to his feet, and he turned to the other side. Running away from the assassin, the guy decided that to begin with he would try to buy some time, and there it would be seen. The hooded man had caught up with him and was already reaching for his collar. A little more, and the young man would be stabbed in the back again. Kim An-seong remembered all of this and suddenly dodged to the side while the assassin lunged forward. This time his knife whistled through the air. With eyes distraught with fear, the young man ran onward, screaming along the road and begging for rescue. He was lucky this time, but Kim An-seo didn't know what to do next. He turned the corner, trying to confuse the assassin. After a moment, the young man clutched his heart and it was getting hard to run. Kim An-seong couldn't catch his breath. Running away from a dangerous pursuer, the young man tried to think on the move, what to do next, and whether to start a fight with the killer. Breathing heavily, the young man looked thoughtfully at the lamppost that illuminated the alley in several places. With a war cry, Kim An-seong ran towards the enemy, sensing that he had nothing to lose anyway. The young man closed his eyes and rushed harder than the wind. He shouted confidently that his enemy had nowhere to go. Suddenly, Kim An-seong caught a glimpse of a silhouette separating from the darkness and realized with horror that the assassin had outsmarted him. At the same moment, his surprised face collided with the powerful fist punch of the hooded man. The blow was strong and precise. Losing his balance, Kim An-seong screamed and flew to the ground, trying to cover his head and soften the blow. The young man lay on the ground and looked at the hooded man with hunted eyes. He knew he was about to pay the price. The assassin approached the young man and looked at him. His eyes clearly read surprise. No one had tried to attack him yet. The man sat on top of the young man, pinning his chest down so that Kim An-seong couldn't even move, and swung the knife at him. The killer plunged the knife straight into his chest and immediately withdrew it. A thin trickle of brown liquid dripped from the bloody blade. Kim An-seong was living the last moments of his life. His frightened eyes stared into the assassin's hood. The man knew that the young man was no longer dangerous, so he walked towards him. He pulled off his hood with his free hand and revealed himself. Kim An-seong would always remember those crazy eyes which were bloodlustful. The killer swung the knife again. Looking at the man closely and his tightly compressed lips, the young man realized that this man was that serial killer from Daejeon. His fading eyes still caught a glimpse of the man's back as he stepped leisurely out of the darkness. He still held the knife in his hand. The assassin throwing the knife away was the last vision the young man could see through the shroud of fog. Immediately afterward, his exhausted eyes began to close, and the young man fell into an eternal sleep. As it turned out, it was a shooting after all. As it turned out, it was filming after all. The director shouted that they had filmed the scene, and the lights around them began to come on. Kim An-seong lay exhaustedly on his back, unable to feel his body from the pain. The director thanked the actor for a job well done. The young man could barely find the strength to open his eyes even a little. Kang continued to praise that Man-seong had done a good job this time. Realizing that the filming of the dangerous episode was finally over, the young man allowed himself to close his eyes again. He sighed with relief. After returning to his room, Kim An-seong immediately fell onto the bed. He couldn't feel his body from fatigue and needed a good rest. Before falling asleep, the young man thought about that serial killer from Daejeon whose face he had managed to see. Kim An-seong closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but now he was too excited and couldn't fall asleep despite being tired. That man with the evil eyes appeared to the young man again. Kim An-seong remembered the birthmarks on his face. The young man remembered his last vision. It had been the man throwing the knife into a secluded spot. Kim An-seong couldn't sleep and was tossing and turning. He tried to convince himself that he was wrong and it couldn't be. The young man was sure that the killer was gone, but still he couldn't shake the thought. He sat up on the bed and pulled out his cell phone. Using a search engine, Kim An-seong tried to find the places where the mysterious killer had left his trail. Soon he had the information he needed, and it gave him some thought. The young man knew what he had to do next. He bought a ticket that afternoon and rode a red and white intercity bus on a busy highway. A colored scoreboard indicated that the transport was from Seoul to Daejeon via the Kumho bus line. Kim An-seong sat comfortably in the chair and closed his eyes. As he tried to doze off, he wondered why he was doing this. After a while, their bus pulled up to a large building. It was the comprehensive terminal of Daejeon City. The driver pulled into a bus parking lot. The automatic door opened silently, and Kim An-seong stepped out, looking around. The young man was walking down the very same street. Things had changed a lot over the years. The buildings and signs were different. Upon reaching the spot where the construction site used to be, the young man found the alleyway still in place and the buildings completed. Kim An-seong walked down the alley and came to the conclusion that this particular place had remained the same and hadn't changed much in decades. The young man walked more and more slowly. When he reached the corner, he carefully peered out, still wary. The boy was sure it was around here somewhere. Suddenly he saw a glint in the dark corner and realized that he was not mistaken, and then the killer had indeed thrown the knife here. Kim An-seong was surprised by his theory. After all, he himself didn't believe he was on the right path until the last moment. The main clue had been found, and it was possible to go to the police with this information. Soon the young man was already entering the station. The officer who spoke to him, as expected, did not believe a word the young man said, and asked if he was a reporter. Kim An-seong turned pale and covered in sweat. He began to hastily explain that he was not a member of the media. The officer asked why he was digging up a case that would go into the archives in 2 months anyway, due to the statute of limitations. Kim An-seong asked the officer to come with him to the scene. The police officer couldn't understand what the guy was thinking, but professional interest won out, and the officer, sighing, reluctantly agreed to accompany the young man to the scene of the crime. He led the guy out of the station and walked him to his patrol car. The officer warned him that he was not to be trifled with. The patrol crew turned out of the parking lot and drove slowly down the narrow street, following the prescribed signs on the road. Not far from the place, the officer stopped the car, and they went further on foot. The man wanted to believe that he had not come for nothing. The officer kept slightly behind the young man, whistling to himself, and Kim An-seong turned around in surprise. Still, the officer was surprised when the guy stopped and pointed to some shiny object in a dark corner. The officer took a closer look and couldn't believe his eyes. It could be that this was the evidence that was missing. The man didn't hide his surprise. For decades, the case had been passed from hand to hand, and no one had been able to find the serial killer. The officer pulled the rubber gloves he had prepared in advance tightly over his hands. Now it was possible to carefully remove the evidence. The man pulled out a bloody knife with dried brown streaks and placed it in a sealed, clear zip bag. The officer returned to the station as soon as possible. It looked like they finally had a lead for the first time in years. The man took the young man into an interview room and asked him to draw a sketch of the man he had seen. Ki-man-sung began to sketch a portrait of the killer from memory. It wasn't hard since it had only happened yesterday. The police chief and his deputy stood in the video surveillance room. They incredulously watched the young man drawing a sketch. The police chief was skeptical of the young man's statement. After all, according to the officer, the young man said that he had just dreamed it all up. The deputy confirmed that's exactly what happened. Moreover, that guy is now making a movie about the incident. The police chief asked if the results of the blood screening test had been sent for review. The deputy said thoughtfully that 7 people had lost their lives at the hands of that murderer, if he was not mistaken. He suggested that the ghosts of the murdered men had come to help. The police chief smirked and said it was a very witty joke. Ki-man-sung finished with the sketch and gestured enthusiastically as he told the investigator more. He nodded in agreement. The deputy chief zoomed in on the monitor for a portrait of the criminal. Suddenly it hit him. He exclaimed that it was the same type. The deputy's face seemed very surprised, for the man was familiar to them. The police chief had not yet realized what the matter was, and asked coldly, turning his head to see what he saw there. The deputy exclaimed that the sketch depicted the same person who was the first suspect in the case. It was only now that the chief of police was surprised to realize what was happening. He shouted that there was no time to delay, that everyone must be rounded up immediately. Ki-man-sung was no longer needed and slowly left the station. The police sirens of the approaching cars blared at the exit. Without paying attention to them, the young man walked on. About a dozen policemen rushed past him into the station. Ki-man-sung did not yet know that their activity was due to the result of his violent activities, and he looked at them perplexedly. Now the young man was in no hurry to go anywhere. He was sure that the police would quickly find the criminal, and he could rest. Ki-man-sung walked on and soon found himself in front of the very house where he had been mistaken for his husband and father. The young man remembered standing a short time ago and looking at the familiar windows of the apartment on the 3rd floor. Things had changed a little now, but the house was still the same, with the same number. He didn't know why he had come to this house. Ki-man-sung still walked closer, and ended up in the parking lot outside the house. Not knowing what to do, he paced back and forth, thinking about the situation. After weighing the pros and cons, the young man decided that the best option for him would still be to just leave. When he turned his back to the house, he met a woman with a tall young man about his age. It suddenly dawned on him that this was the same woman and son who had lost a member of their family. The dark-haired woman looked tired, but it was still the exact woman from his hero's memories. Yes, and the expression in her son's eyes was still the same as it had been a couple decades ago. It was definitely them. Ki-man-sung stared at them for a while. He couldn't think of anything else he could do for this family. The young man told his mother that they had recently received a call from the police station informing them that a suspect in a case had come forward. The woman sighed heavily and replied that their police somehow catch the wrong person every time. The young man protested to his mother that things looked different now. It seemed that this time they had really hit the right trail. The mother sadly replied that this would be a good thing, for he who committed the crime must be punished. The young man agreed with her and said he wished he had his father back that day. Ki-man-sung was standing near the neighboring entranceway at this time, so he could clearly hear every word of their conversation. It was a new, sunny summer day. Birds sat on the telephone wires and chirped merrily. Ki-man-sung had fallen asleep in the morning, so he was now tossing and turning restlessly in his sleep. The phone was lying there beside the pillow. The phone started ringing, but the young man was too tired to hear. It wasn't until a few minutes later that Ki-man-sung saw the flashing LED light. The young man reluctantly opened his eyes and sighed heavily. Then he turned his head toward his phone and saw the notifications. Ki-man-sung reached for the phone to see who wanted to chat with him while he slept peacefully. Taking the phone in his hands, the young man sat on the bed. His hair was disheveled because he'd been tossing and turning all night and couldn't sleep. After seeing 4 unanswered calls, the young man realized he was too tired and explained it to himself by driving all the way to Taijeon. Suddenly the phone rang again and Ki-man-sung flinched in surprise. He didn't know who needed him that badly. The phone kept ringing. The screen showed a number unknown to the young man, and he hesitated whether to accept the call. Still, he picked up the phone and said hello. It turned out to be a call from the Useong police station in Daejeon. Ki-man-sung asked what was required of him, and the policeman faltered a bit, trying to describe the situation more correctly. The officer on duty explained that they needed the personal details of a witness in the case. He glanced toward the window. The young man did not understand what was the matter, and the officer watching the window said they were now in a very difficult position. He explained that this was why they needed the details of the witness who had helped to sketch the killer. It was noisy outside the window. The officer suggested that the young man turn on the television. There was a real siege outside the station. The chief and the deputy were being interviewed. The cameras kept clicking. The journalists begged for anything about the secret identity of their witness. Kim An-sung couldn't believe such popularity around his name. He leisurely turned on the news channel on the television. At first, they talked about some obscure news that had nothing to do with his case, and the young man understood nothing. An image of a cat with an identifying Qurani name tag was displayed on the full screen, which was also similar to the word cat. Suddenly, this show was interrupted by a breaking news bulletin. There was a large full-screen sign saying that the culprit had been caught. Kim An-sung was very surprised and stared with his mouth hanging open. He had no idea that the reporters would find out so quickly. The presenter introduced the sketch and said that the identity of the witness was being carefully concealed by the police. She suggested contacting a reporter who was on the scene. It was noticeable that reporter Park Sang-ho was standing outside the station with a whole crowd of people behind him. He confirmed that the name of the witness was unknown. Sang-ho added that recent reports have revealed that the witness is related to a movie based on the incident. When asked by the TV host, the reporter said that the movie Stalker of Darkness was directed by Yoo Jin-soo. Kim An-sung turned off the TV. He realized that he had become too famous and it was better to keep a low profile. The young man wondered what this could all add up to, and if he had created any new problems for himself. Time was running out, and it was time to go to work. Kim Ah-sung left the house and was soon approaching the nearest subway station. The carriage was almost empty and no one paid any attention to him. The gentleman was reading a newspaper, and the girl opposite was not interested in him at all. Kim An-sung decided to make the most of his time and read the latest news. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. This movie was all over the news. Tickets were sold out immediately. The number of screenings passed the 10 million mark. The young man thought for a moment. So far, no one had suspected that he was a witness, and he would like to keep it that way. Kim An-sung came out of the subway and asked the officer not to reveal his identity. The officer on duty assured the young man not to worry. So far, things were working out pretty well. The young man was glad that everything had gone smoothly, but he still had to be careful. After a while, the guy arrived at the central office of the MS Film Company. When he checked his watch, he realized that he was not late. The manager, Moon Young-bi, was already waiting for him at the main entrance. He looked surprised at the young man who greeted him. They came closer to each other, and Moon reproached the young man for wanting to pick him up by car. He argued that it was more convenient to take the subway. The manager thought for a moment. He was quite surprised and asked if any of the passengers recognized the young man. Kim An-sung found the manager's question strange. He replied that it was unlikely that anyone would recognize him at all. Moon said that he has excelled in his role and has already received more than 7 offers from different movies for supporting roles. The young man couldn't help himself and shouted across the street, almost crying, that there was no way he was going to die again. Manager Moon worriedly took the young man by the shoulder and assured him that it was quite enough. He understood. They were walking down the street and the manager explained that the young man was required to try out for a romantic role because he was good-looking. He should have done well in his first ever interview. Kim An-sung tried to contradict John Bae. After all, there are enough celebrities in the world without him. The manager revealed that the reporter's name is Han Chae-won, and she is a very famous person. Manager Moon was at one time struck by her mysterious look, and so did not immediately remember that she was called the Ghost of Sensation. Recalling the profile of the mysteriously smiling girl, Moon revealed that the journalist insisted on meeting Kim An-sung. The manager went to the door and opened it ajar. The door creaked open, and the girl shouted that they could come in. A girl with dark hair sat at a small table. She was shyly fixing her hair in front of an open laptop. A young man walked through the door with Moon, and Chae-won immediately recognized him as a rising star in the Korean film industry. She smiled at the young man and exclaimed that Kim An-sung looked even better in person than on TV. The manager seated the young man in a chair across from the reporter and warned the girl that this would be a first interview for him. Han Chae-won smiled dazzlingly at the manager and assured him that he could not worry about the young man. Everything would be at its best. Manager Moon considered his mission accomplished and left. The young man and the girl looked at each other, and there was an awkward pause. Chae-won knew well how to get out of such situations. She smiled warmly at the young man and turned to him. Kim An-sung felt a little stiff, so he looked at the girl warily. He didn't want any unnecessary publicity. Smiling, Han Chae-won asked if the young man knew that the recently released movie had become so popular because of him. Kim An-sung was taken aback by such a statement from the girl. After all, he was far from playing a major role in it, and it surprised him. The reporter explained that views of the movie increased after the young man helped catch the criminal. The boy turned pale. A charming smile appeared on the girl's face. She would like to know how the young man managed to recognize the criminal's appearance. The girl leaned closer and looked the young man in the eye. She asked if he had really seen the killer's face in his dream, as the police claimed. Ki Man-sung felt sweat trickling down his cheek. He hadn't expected this kind of questioning since his identity was promised to be kept secret. The awkward pause was broken by Manager Moon. He came to their table with a tray with 3 glasses of drinks on it. Han Chae-won smiled and thanked the manager for the drink. Turning to the young man, she offered to continue the conversation later. The manager didn't realize what had happened in the few minutes he'd been gone, and twirled his head in puzzlement. The girl smirked. Han Chae-won offered to start the interview. She turned on the recorder and asked when the young man had his dream of becoming an actor. Since the young man was silent, the girl looked at him enigmatically and told him not to worry so much. She's a real fan of his. Putting away the recorder, she looked at the guy intently and said that his acting was completely different. Ki Man-sung turned pale. He realized that she wanted something.